1 minute, and then walked out of my life. Through the glass doors of the mall, I watched my parents' car pull away without the slightest hesitation, leaving me behind as if I were something they couldn't be bothered to deal with anymore. But a stranger named Arthur Bennett noticed the little girl trembling alone on that bench. He brought me home. He raised me. He loved me like his own. 30 years later, when Arthur died, I learned that the man who had rescued me had quietly built a fortune. In his will, he left me $4 million. That's when my past came back for me. The parents who had abandoned me suddenly remembered I existed the moment the news of my inheritance spread. They hired a lawyer, invented a heartbreaking story about their missing daughter, and dragged me into court demanding every dollar. They believed I was still that powerless child they'd left behind. But as I sat at the defendant's table watching them whisper and grin about how easily they would ruin me, their attorney stepped into the courtroom. His eyes fell on me, and the color drained from his face. Then he spoke the 5 words that silenced the entire room. "Good morning, Judge O'Hara." They had no idea what Arthur Bennett had helped me build, and they certainly didn't expect what I had waiting for them. Stay with me, because what happened next in that courtroom didn't just destroy their case. It exposed 3 decades of lies, tore apart a carefully crafted family myth, and proved that the child they abandoned had grown into the one person they should never have underestimated. This is the story of how I made them answer for every second they left me standing there. My name is Catherine O'Hara. I'm 35 years old, and I serve as a magistrate judge in the U.S. District Court for the Eastern District of Pennsylvania, the same region where I grew up. People who meet me today see someone calm and professional, someone who built a life filled with purpose. What they don't see is the 5-year-old girl I used to be, the one who learned, on a cold November afternoon in 1993, that the people who were supposed to love you most could walk away without ever looking back. That day began like any other Saturday. My mother woke me early and told me we were going to the mall. I remember feeling excited because we almost never went anywhere together as a family. I pulled on my purple coat, the one with the broken zipper that never stayed closed, and grabbed my stuffed rabbit with the missing eye. I had named him Mr. Hoppy. My father, Michael O'Hara, barely acknowledged me as we climbed into the car, but that wasn't unusual. He rarely spoke unless it was to tell me to be quiet or stay out of the way. The drive to King of Prussia Mall took about 20 minutes. I pressed my face against the cold window, watching the world rush past and imagining all the toys I might see. My mother hadn't promised anything, but in the mind of a 5-year-old, a trip to the mall meant possibilities. Maybe she'd buy me something. Maybe we'd eat at the food court. Maybe, just for once, they'd look happy to have me with them. When we arrived, my mother took my hand and guided me through the entrance. The mall was crowded that afternoon, buzzing with early holiday shoppers. Thanksgiving hadn't even arrived yet, but Christmas decorations already hung from the ceiling, lights sparkling overhead and making everything feel magical. My mother walked quickly, though. She didn't pause to look at anything, and she didn't let me stop either. My father followed behind us with his hands in his pockets, his face distant and uninterested. Eventually, we reached the toy section of a large department store. Shelves filled with dolls, action figures, board games, and stuffed animals stretched out in every direction. To me, it looked like an entire universe made of toys. My mother crouched down so we were face to face. For a brief second, I thought she might actually smile. Instead, she adjusted my coat and said, "Stay right here, sweetie. Mommy needs to use the restroom. I'll be back in 1 minute. Count to 60. "Okay," I said eagerly, clutching Mr. Hoppy tighter against my chest. Counting to 60 was something I knew how to do. I was proud of that. She stood up, lightly patted the top of my head, and walked away. I watched her purple sweater disappear into the crowd. Then I began to count. 1, 2, 3. I counted slowly and carefully, making sure not to skip a single number. 4, 5, 6. Shoppers flowed around me like water moving around a rock in a stream. 7, 8, 9. A mother and her daughter passed by, the little girl laughing as she pointed at a toy. 10, 11, 12. When I reached 60, I stopped and waited. My mother had said 1 minute, but she didn't come back. So I counted to 60 again, thinking maybe I had counted too quickly the first time. Still nothing. The bright fluorescent lights above the toy aisle, lights that had seemed so exciting moments earlier, now felt harsh and overwhelming. I shifted from one foot to the other, hugging Mr. Hoppy closer. I counted to 60 a third time, then a fourth. Children ran past me with their parents, pointing at toys, begging for things, hearing yes or no or maybe. But every one of them had someone beside them. I stood in the exact spot my mother had left me, too afraid to move and too afraid to call out. What if she came back and couldn't find me? What if I got in trouble for not staying where she told me to? 10 minutes passed, then 20, maybe longer. I couldn't read a clock yet, and I didn't have a watch, so I had no way to know exactly how much time had gone by. I only knew it was far more than 1 minute. My legs began to ache from standing so still, and even though I was inside the building, my hands had started to feel cold. A store employee walked past me twice, each time slowing down a little, glancing at me with a worried look. I could tell she was trying to figure out why a little girl was standing alone in the toy aisle. But I didn't know how to explain that I was waiting for my mom without sounding like a baby who couldn't handle being left alone for a minute. Then I saw them. Through the tall glass windows at the front of King of Prussia Mall, I spotted the familiar flash of my mother's purple sweater moving across the parking lot. She wasn't running. She wasn't scanning the crowd like someone who had lost a child. She was simply walking, calmly, steadily, toward the rows of parked cars. My father, Michael O'Hara, walked beside her with his hands in his pockets, his stride relaxed and unhurried. They were leaving. Without thinking, I lifted my hand and waved through the glass, a small, desperate gesture of recognition. Maybe they had forgotten something in the car. Maybe they were coming right back. Maybe this was all some kind of mistake. My mother turned her head slightly, and for a brief second our eyes met across the distance. I waited for her expression to change. I waited for panic to flash across her face. I waited for her to realize she had left me inside. But none of that happened. There was no shock, no sudden fear, no look of a parent realizing they had made a terrible mistake. Instead, there was something cold in her eyes, something final. It looked less like confusion and more like confirmation, as if she were silently approving a decision she had already made long before we ever came to the mall. Then she turned away. She kept walking. My father never even glanced back. I watched them reach a dark sedan I recognized as ours. I watched them open the doors, slide inside, and shut them again. I watched the car back out of the parking space. I watched the red brake lights glow. I watched those lights grow smaller and smaller as the car merged into traffic. And I kept watching until they disappeared completely. That was the moment I understood something, though I didn't yet have the words for it. I hadn't been forgotten. I had been left, on purpose. I don't remember when I started crying, but I must have, because the next thing I remember is a security guard kneeling beside me, asking questions I couldn't answer through my sobbing. Eventually they led me away from the toy section to a small office tucked behind the mall corridors. The room had gray walls and uncomfortable plastic chairs. Someone handed me a small carton of juice and a packet of crackers. They asked for my name. They asked for my parents' names. They asked where I lived. I told them everything I knew, which, at 5 years old, wasn't very much. What I didn't know was that high above us, the mall's silent security cameras had captured everything. The footage showed my mother leading me into the toy section at 2:47 p.m., telling me to wait. At 2:51 p.m., just 4 minutes later, those same cameras recorded my parents walking out of the building. The video showed a mall employee stopping them near the entrance, clearly asking them something. My father waved his hand dismissively. My mother shook her head and said a few quick words. Then they walked away. That night, the mall's security team would watch that footage again and again, trying to make sense of what they were seeing. It wasn't an accident. It wasn't confusion. It wasn't a momentary lapse in attention. It was deliberate. a calculated act of abandonment recorded frame by frame on security cameras. But something else happened that night, something none of us could have predicted. Because someone else would see that footage, and that person would make a decision that would change my life forever. The security office felt smaller as the hours dragged on. I sat in the hard plastic chair with my legs dangling above the floor, clutching Mr. Hoppy tightly against my chest. The guards tried to be kind. They brought me snacks and spoke gently, trying to make me feel safe. But I could see the worry in their faces. They made phone calls. They filled out paperwork. They asked me the same questions again and again, as if somehow my answers might change. They didn't. By the time evening began to fall, I had stopped crying. I didn't feel better. I just felt empty, like something important had been taken out of me, and nothing had been put back to replace it. Through the office window, I could see shoppers passing by, carrying bags, holding hands with their children, living ordinary lives that suddenly felt impossibly far away from mine. That was when I noticed him. A man in his mid-50s sat on a bench outside the security office. He wasn't staring directly at me, but it was clear he knew I was there. He wore a simple gray sweater and khaki pants. Nothing about him stood out at first glance, but there was something gentle in his face. His eyes were kind in a way that felt genuine, not forced. His hands looked weathered, like someone who had worked hard for many years, yet they rested calmly in his lap as he sat there quietly, waiting. I watched him through the glass as security guards and mall staff continued trying to figure out what to do with me. He didn't rush over. He didn't interrupt. He simply sat there, patient and still, as if time didn't matter. Every now and then our eyes would meet, and he would offer a small, reassuring smile. Not the kind adults use when they want children to behave, but the kind that says everything might somehow turn out okay. After what felt like a very long time, he finally stood up. He walked slowly toward the security office door and knocked gently before speaking with one of the guards. I couldn't hear their conversation, but I saw the guard glance toward me and nod. The man asked if he could speak with me. After a moment of hesitation, they allowed it. He stepped inside carefully, moving with the quiet awareness of someone who understood that sudden movements might frighten a child. He didn't loom over me. He didn't crouch down in that exaggerated way adults sometimes use with kids. Instead, he pulled a chair closer and sat so we were at the same height. For a moment, he said nothing at all. Then he asked softly, almost casually, "Are you cold? Would you like some hot chocolate?" It was such a simple question, so different from the endless official questions I had been answering all afternoon. I nodded, unable to trust my voice. He stood up, spoke briefly with the security staff, and returned a few minutes later carrying 2 steaming cups of hot chocolate from the mall cafe. He handed one to me and waited patiently while I took a cautious sip. Then he took a sip from his own. "My name is Arthur Bennett," he said gently. I whispered my name in return, so quietly I wasn't sure he heard it. But he nodded as if he had. Soon we were sitting together in the small cafe area of the mall, away from the busy security office. Arthur didn't ask why I was alone. He didn't push for explanations. Instead, he told me something I would remember for the rest of my life. "When I was 6 years old," he began in a calm, steady voice, "I lived in an orphanage." He paused for a moment before continuing. "It was a big place, lots of children, lots of noise, people everywhere all the time, but somehow I still felt completely alone." He looked at me thoughtfully. "I remember what it feels like to be surrounded by people and still feel invisible, like nobody really sees you, like you're just there, waiting for something that never comes." His words wrapped around me like a blanket. Because somehow this stranger understood exactly what I was feeling. Somehow this stranger understood exactly what had been crushing me all day. He understood that strange kind of loneliness that exists even when people are all around you. The feeling of being invisible, of knowing you are somewhere you were never truly wanted. "I'm very sorry this happened to you," Arthur Bennett said softly, still looking directly into my eyes. "You deserved better. You deserve better." There was something about the way he said it that made me believe him. Not deserved in the past tense, like it was something already lost forever, but deserve in the present, as if the future still held possibilities I couldn't yet imagine. Arthur stayed with me as the mall staff continued making calls. He stayed when the police arrived and began taking statements. He stayed while they explained that no missing child report matched my description, that no one had called the police to report a 5-year-old girl missing, that my parents hadn't contacted the mall asking if a lost child had been found. They said social services would have to be notified, but it was late. No one would arrive until morning. Arthur stayed through all of it, this complete stranger who owed me absolutely nothing. Eventually, one of the officers asked the room a practical question. If social services wouldn't arrive until morning, did anyone have a place where the child could stay safely for the night? Arthur spoke up immediately. I can provide temporary care until everything is sorted out, he said calmly. The police didn't take the offer lightly. They ran a background check, they made several phone calls, they verified his identity and confirmed his address. Everything came back clean. They were looking for a safe solution for the night. Arthur Bennett had just offered one. By the time we left the mall, the sky outside had already grown dark. Arthur drove me through quiet city streets toward Philadelphia, the headlights cutting through the evening traffic. I sat silently in the passenger seat holding Mr. Hoppy against my chest and trying to understand how a day that had started like an ordinary Saturday had somehow turned into this. His house stood on a quiet street in Chestnut Hill, a modest 2-bedroom home with wooden floors that creaked softly when you walked across them. It smelled faintly of old books and lemon furniture polish. The house was tidy, warm in a way my own home had never felt. Arthur showed me around briefly, careful not to overwhelm me. Then he went into the kitchen and prepared dinner, simple grilled cheese sandwiches with tomato soup. I ate slowly, still not entirely convinced any of this was real. After dinner, he found a pair of old pajamas for me to wear. They were far too big, hanging from my small frame like a costume. The sleeves extended past my hands and the pant legs pooled around my feet. Arthur knelt down and carefully folded the cuffs so I wouldn't trip. Then he led me down the hallway to a small guest bedroom. The bed was neatly made with clean white sheets. A small nightlight glowed softly in the corner, casting a gentle yellow light across the room. Before I climbed into bed, Arthur knelt beside me once more. "You're safe here," he said quietly. There was something firm in his voice, not just kindness, but a promise. "Whatever happens tomorrow, tonight you're safe. Can you trust me on that?" I nodded, too tired to speak. He stood and walked toward the door, then paused and glanced back. "If you need anything during the night, my room is right across the hall," he said. "Don't be afraid to wake me." He left the door slightly open. I lay in that unfamiliar bed clutching Mr. Hoppy, listening to the soft creaks and quiet sounds of a stranger's house settling around me. For the first time all day, it felt like I could finally breathe. Arthur had promised I would be safe that night, and somehow, I believed he meant it. What I didn't know then was that Arthur Bennett's past would one day become tangled with my own future in ways neither of us could have predicted. That first night turned into a second, then a third. Soon, a full week had passed. Social workers came by the house. They asked questions and filled out paperwork. They tried to locate my parents. They searched for relatives who might take responsibility for me. No one came forward. My parents never filed a missing person report. They never contacted the police. They never called the mall asking if anyone had found a little girl. They disappeared from my life as completely and deliberately as they had walked out of that toy aisle. Arthur never forced me to talk about what had happened. He simply allowed me to exist in his home, giving me the space to heal at my own pace. Slowly, day by day, I began to discover what safety actually felt like. Dinner became something I looked forward to instead of something I feared. Every evening at exactly 6 o'clock, Arthur would set the table and we would sit down together. He would ask me how my day had been, and he truly listened to the answer. Not the distracted listening adults sometimes pretend to give children. Real listening. Sometimes he shared little details about his own day in return. There was no yelling in that house, no tense silence, No constant feeling that I had to make myself small or invisible to avoid upsetting someone. Bedtime changed, too. Arthur read to me every night, sitting in the chair beside my bed with a book in his hands. He read slowly, giving each character its own voice, never rushing through the pages as if he had somewhere more important to be. On the nights when nightmares woke me, when I sat up trembling and confused, I would often find him already standing in the doorway, having heard me stir. He would sit beside the bed until I fell asleep again. Sometimes he read another chapter. Sometimes he simply stayed there quietly. Morning routines revealed even more. Arthur woke at the same time every day. I would hear him moving through the house with calm, predictable rhythms, coffee brewing in the kitchen, quiet footsteps across the floor, a soft hum as he prepared breakfast. When I appeared in the doorway, whether cheerful or withdrawn, he greeted me the same way every time. "Good morning, Catherine." There was no tension in his voice, no unpredictable moods. He was reliable. He was safe. Those small routines might seem ordinary to someone who had always lived that way, but to a child whose world had once felt unstable and frightening, they rebuilt something deep inside me that had been broken. For a long time I didn't say it out loud, but in my mind, I began to think of that house as home. Arthur never tried to erase my past or pretend my biological parents didn't exist. Sometimes family was the person who chose you, the person who showed up every single day, the person who made you feel like your presence mattered. Gradually, the nightmares that had haunted my first weeks there began to fade. In their place came dreams where I felt safe, dreams where I belonged. What I didn't know at the time was that Arthur Bennett had installed security cameras inside his home years earlier. Arthur had installed the cameras years before I ever entered his life, after a break-in had left him uneasy about the safety of his home. They were small and easy to miss, quietly positioned in the living room, the kitchen, and along the hallway ceilings. Arthur never mentioned them to me. He didn't want me to feel watched or studied. More than anything, he wanted that house to be a place where I could simply exist, where I could heal without feeling like every step I took was being observed. Still, the cameras recorded everything. They captured the first time I laughed, a real laugh, about 3 months after I moved in. Arthur had been making pancakes for breakfast and tried to flip one dramatically in the air. Instead of landing back in the pan, it slid right off the edge and landed on the kitchen floor. For a second, we both stared at it in silence. Then I burst out laughing. They captured another moment about 6 months later. I was standing in my bedroom doorway when he said goodnight. Without thinking, I answered, "Good night, Dad." Not Arthur. Dad. Arthur froze for a second in the hallway. The cameras caught the way he paused, his hands still on the doorframe, his eyes suddenly shining with emotion he tried to hide. All those quiet, ordinary moments that slowly turned a stranger and a frightened child into a family. The recording sat untouched on a hard drive somewhere in that house. Unlabeled. Unexamined. A silent archive of healing that neither of us could have imagined would matter decades later. That fall, Arthur enrolled me in school. He handled the paperwork himself, attending meetings with administrators and teachers, explaining only what needed to be explained. He never pushed me to talk about my past with counselors or teachers, even when well-meaning adults suggested I might need to process my trauma. Arthur believed something different. He believed I would talk when I was ready. And until then, he would simply give me time. He showed up for everything. Every parent-teacher conference, every school play, every science fair project displayed on folding tables in crowded gymnasiums. When my second-grade teacher pulled him aside one afternoon and mentioned that I seemed to struggle with attachment issues, that I became anxious when he left me at school or when he arrived late to pick me up, Arthur didn't dismiss it. Instead, he found a therapist, not someone cold or clinical, not someone who treated me like a broken problem that needed fixing. A gentle woman named Dr. Laura Simmons, who filled her office with toys and art supplies and let our conversations unfold naturally while we played games on the floor. She never made me feel damaged, only understood. When I started doing well in school, Arthur encouraged my curiosity rather than turning it into pressure. Every Saturday morning he took me to the library. He would let me check out as many books as I could carry in my arms. Sometimes the stack reached my chin. He helped me with homework too, but never by simply giving me the answers. Instead, he guided me through the questions, teaching me how to think through problems on my own. He never made me feel like I had to earn his love through grades or achievements. He supported whatever caught my interest, whatever made me feel confident and capable. Arthur never tried to replace my biological parents in my story. He never spoke badly about them. He never tried to erase them from my past or make me feel guilty for the complicated emotions I carried about being abandoned. Instead, he quietly built something new with me, a relationship grounded in patience, respect, and choice. Through his actions, not his words, Arthur showed me that trust could be rebuilt, that not every adult walked away, that my worth wasn't determined by the people who had once decided I didn't matter. Over time, I began to believe that I deserved good things. I learned that love could be steady, reliable, unconditional. And I learned something even more important. Home wasn't a house. Home was the feeling of safety you carried inside you, the kind of safety created by someone who chose you every single day and meant it. The nightmares that had haunted my early months there slowly faded away. In their place came dreams where I felt secure, dreams where I belonged. But the past has a way of finding its way back into your life. I was 14 when everything finally came into focus for me, when the scattered pieces of my childhood suddenly arranged themselves into a clear direction. Arthur and I were sitting in the living room one Tuesday evening, flipping through television channels, looking for something interesting to watch. We stopped on a documentary about family law and the child welfare system. At first, I almost asked him to keep changing the channel, but something made me stay. The documentary followed several real cases involving children caught in complicated custody disputes, kids navigating adoption hearings, abuse investigations, and foster care placements. It showed lawyers arguing before judges, social workers struggling with impossible decisions, children sitting quietly in waiting rooms while adults debated what their futures would look like. As I watched, something shifted inside me. For the first time, I realized there was an entire system built to protect children like I had once been. There were people whose entire careers were dedicated to standing up for kids who couldn't defend themselves. There were laws designed to make sure children had advocates, stability, and safety. I became fascinated, then obsessed. I started checking out books from the library about family law, juvenile justice, and child advocacy. I read court cases online, trying to understand the strange language lawyers used and the logic behind legal arguments. I wanted to understand everything: how courts decided custody, how adoption worked, what legally counted as abandonment, and how it differed from kidnapping. Questions that had haunted me since I was 5 years old finally began to find answers in legal precedent and statutes. Arthur noticed how intensely I had thrown myself into it. He would sometimes walk into the kitchen late at night and find me sitting at the table surrounded by stacks of library books and printed articles, scribbling notes into a spiral notebook. For weeks, he simply watched quietly. Then one evening, he sat down across from me and asked gently, "What is it about all this that interests you so much, Catherine?" I looked up at him, trying to put the feeling into words. "The law protected me when my real parents didn't," I said slowly. "When they left me at the mall, the system stepped in. Social workers got involved. There were procedures, rules, things that made sure I didn't just disappear. Because of those rules, you were able to adopt me legally." I paused, searching for the right way to say the rest. "Maybe I could do that for other kids," I continued. "Maybe I could be the person who stands up for children who don't have anyone else." Arthur Bennett's eyes glistened, though the tears never quite fell. He reached across the kitchen table and squeezed my hand gently. "Then that's exactly what you'll do," he said without hesitation. There was no doubt in his voice. He didn't tell me I was too young to make such a serious decision. He didn't suggest that I should choose something more practical. He didn't warn me about how difficult law school would be. He didn't treat my words like a teenage phase that I would eventually grow out of. He simply believed me, completely. That belief became the foundation on which I built everything that came afterward. Through high school and college, I threw myself into my education with relentless focus. I wasn't the kind of student who breezed through classes effortlessly. I wasn't naturally brilliant. What I was, however, was determined. I stayed up late studying when other students slept. I rewrote essays until every sentence felt right. I prepared obsessively for exams. My motivation didn't come from competition or ambition alone. It came from somewhere deeper. I was building armor. Every grade, every credential, every accomplishment was another layer between the powerless child I had once been and the person I was determined to become. Yet my past didn't make me cold. If anything, it made me more compassionate, more sensitive to suffering, more determined to protect people who had no one else defending them. In high school, I joined the mock trial team and quickly developed a reputation for defending the underdog in every case we practiced. When I argued before judges in those mock courtrooms, I didn't just cite statutes and precedent. I tried to make them feel what was at stake, to understand the human cost behind legal decisions. By the time I reached college, my professors were writing in recommendation letters that I argued cases as if real lives depended on the outcome. They were right, because in my mind, every legal argument was personal. Every brief I wrote was a promise to the 5-year-old girl I used to be, the girl who had stood alone in a toy aisle wondering why she hadn't been worth keeping. I was promising her that I would never let another child feel that kind of abandonment without someone fighting for them. That I would use every skill I developed to stand between vulnerable children and the people who would harm them or walk away from them. Arthur attended everything, every mock trial competition, every moot court presentation, every academic ceremony. He would sit quietly in the back row, always with a leather-bound journal resting in his lap. During my presentations, I often noticed him writing, and I assumed he was simply jotting down thoughts or passing the time. What I didn't know then was that he was documenting my entire journey. Years later, after he was gone, I would discover those journals locked inside a drawer in his study. Page after page filled with careful observations about my growth, my arguments, and the compassion he saw shaping the person I was becoming. One entry read, "Today Catherine argued for a child's right to stability. She didn't just cite precedent, she made the judges understand what abandonment feels like. She turned legal theory into human experience. I have never been more proud." Another entry, written during my second year of law school, described a mock case involving parental neglect. "I watched Catherine defend a hypothetical child today. Her logic was sharp, precise, devastating. But what struck me most was that she never lost sight of the child at the center of the case. She fought for that imaginary child as if she were fighting for herself at 5 years old. She has taken pain and turned it into purpose. This is what redemption looks like." Arthur never showed me those journals while he was alive. They were his private record, his quiet way of honoring the privilege of watching a wounded child grow into someone strong. They were love letters written not to be read, but simply to exist. Proof that a father's pride doesn't require shared DNA. Proof that chosen family can run deeper than blood. I graduated from law school in the top 5% of my class. I passed the bar exam on my first attempt. Soon afterward, I became a prosecutor specializing in family law and child welfare cases, the kinds of cases that would break many attorneys emotionally. I handled situations involving abused children, neglected households, and broken families. I fought to secure safe adoptions for kids trapped in foster care. I helped hold parents accountable when they had failed their own children. Every victory felt personal, because it was. Arthur was there for all of it. Whenever he could, he sat quietly in the courtroom during hearings. When he couldn't attend, he called afterward to ask how the case had gone. He celebrated my successes and stood beside me during the difficult losses that inevitably came with the work. He never once took credit for any of it. He never suggested that my achievements reflected his parenting. He simply loved me, believed in me, and provided the stability that allowed me to become who I was meant to be. But while I was building a life devoted to justice and protection, somewhere else, 2 people were living comfortably inside a lie. While I dedicated my career to defending children and uncovering truth, my biological parents were constructing something entirely different. A story. A carefully crafted lie that would sustain them for nearly 3 decades. I wouldn't understand the full scope of their deception until many years later. But when I finally pieced it all together, the calculated nature of it left me breathless. From the moment they drove away from King of Prussia Mall in 1993, Michael O'Hara and Linda O'Hara began building a narrative that would shield them from judgment and protect them from consequences. A story that allowed them to present themselves as victims rather than the people who had abandoned their child. They told everyone the same version of events. Over time, repetition smoothed the lie until it sounded almost like truth. Their daughter had been kidnapped at a mall. They had only turned their backs for a moment. When they looked back, she was gone. They had searched frantically. They had called the police. They had spent sleepless nights imagining the worst. And eventually, after years of heartbreak, they had been forced to accept that they might never know what had happened to their little girl. Their neighbors received the story with the kind of sympathy people reserve for unimaginable tragedy. Their church held annual prayer services for the child who had vanished. Michael O'Hara and Linda O'Hara attended every one of those services, sitting together in the pews with solemn expressions carefully arranged across their faces. Over time, the lie became so practiced that even they seemed to half believe it themselves. Linda perfected a soft, sorrowful smile that appeared whenever anyone mentioned children. Michael developed a distant look in his eyes, as though he were staring at memories too painful to describe. They had mastered the timing. How long to let a conversation about their lost daughter linger before gently changing the subject with quiet resignation. To the outside world, they appeared to be parents carrying their grief with quiet dignity. But behind the performance, there was nothing. They never filed a missing person report. They never hired a private investigator. They never appeared on local news broadcasts begging for information. They never organized search parties or printed flyers with my photograph. The frantic search they described to others existed only in conversation, stories repeated often enough to feel real. The desperate effort they claimed had never existed anywhere in documented reality. Then, in 1996, 3 years after abandoning me, Linda gave birth to another daughter. They named her Emily. With her arrival, their deception gained a new layer. Emily grew up under the shadow of a sister she had never met, raised on a ghost story that shaped her understanding of her entire family. "You had an older sister named Catherine," they told her when she was old enough to ask about the sadness that seemed to linger in their home. "When you were a baby, terrible people took her from us. We searched everywhere, but we never found her. She's gone, and we don't even know if she's alive." Emily absorbed that story the way children absorb everything their parents tell them, with complete trust. She grew up believing she was the surviving child of a tragic family, the daughter who remained after the other had been stolen away. She interpreted her parents' financial struggles as consequences of grief. She believed their emotional distance came from hearts that had been broken beyond repair. Sometimes, in the quietest corners of her thoughts, she even wondered whether they secretly wished it had been her who had disappeared instead. Emily never questioned the missing details. Why there were no photographs of her sister displayed anywhere in the house. Why her parents discouraged her whenever she tried to research missing children cases. Why they became strangely uncomfortable when she asked for specific memories about the sister they claimed to have loved so deeply. The lie was complete, consistent. It shaped Emily's identity. She grew up believing she was the daughter left behind by tragedy. Meanwhile, Michael and Linda O'Hara's lives slowly unraveled, and not because of grief. Without the responsibility of raising 2 children, they didn't flourish. They deteriorated. Michael drifted from job to job, rarely keeping a position longer than a few years. His gambling addiction, something that had already existed long before they abandoned me, grew worse with time. Entire paychecks disappeared into casinos. He always believed the next bet would fix everything. Linda enabled him, covering for his absences and failures, making excuses to employers and family members. She had her own compulsions. Credit card balances grew as she spent money on shopping sprees that offered brief relief from whatever emptiness followed her. She filled their home with purchases they didn't need and couldn't afford, chasing a satisfaction that never lasted. Over the years, they refinanced their house again and again, pulling out equity to pay debts, always hovering just one financial crisis away from foreclosure. Their marriage became cold and transactional. It wasn't love that held them together anymore. It was the lie. They needed each other to maintain it, to confirm the same story whenever someone asked about their missing daughter. In private, they rarely spoke about me at all. I became the unspoken truth buried beneath their shared denial. Acknowledging what they had actually done would have forced them to see themselves clearly, not as victims, but as the people responsible. So they ran from that truth for 30 years. But they weren't running toward anything meaningful. They were simply running away, using the story of their missing daughter to excuse every failure, every bad decision, every disappointment that followed. I became their tragedy, and their alibi, the missing piece that explained why their lives never quite worked out. Emily grew up watching the slow collapse of her parents' lives, interpreting everything through the lies she had been given. She thought she understood her family. She believed she knew their story. She had no idea that the entire narrative had been built on deliberate cruelty and carefully maintained deception. For 3 decades, Michael and Linda O'Hara got away with it. They convinced their neighbors, their church, even their own daughter. They turned abandonment into tragedy, cruelty into misfortune, choice into circumstance. But all lies eventually face the moment when reality breaks through. While my biological parents lived inside that carefully maintained fiction, I was building something real. I graduated from law school in the top 5% of my class, earning several honors and receiving offers from prestigious law firms across the country. I declined every one of them. Corporate law, intellectual property disputes, and contract negotiations held no appeal for me. I had always known where I belonged. I joined the district attorney's office in Philadelphia, starting in the family law division. From the beginning, my colleagues noticed that I approached cases differently than most prosecutors. I was relentless when pursuing justice, methodical in building cases against abusers and neglectful parents. But I was never cruel. I didn't grandstand in courtrooms. I never turned victims' pain into a spectacle for personal recognition. I was strategic without being manipulative, passionate without losing control. I quickly gravitated toward child welfare cases, the kinds that drove many prosecutors to request transfers after only a few months. Cases involving children found in drug houses, kids beaten by the very people who were supposed to protect them. Neglect so severe it bordered on torture. Some attorneys left those cases hardened. Others left them emotionally shattered. But every case only strengthened my resolve. Because every child I stood up for reminded me of the 5-year-old girl I had once been, and I refused to fail them. By the time I was 32, I had secured convictions against numerous abusers, helped remove countless children from dangerous homes, and earned a reputation within the office. My colleagues sometimes referred to me as the prosecutor who actually cared. They said it with admiration, sometimes with mild criticism, like caring too deeply might be a weakness in our profession. But I understood something they didn't. Caring wasn't a liability. It was exactly what made me effective. I could stand in a courtroom and look at bruised children, broken families, and lives that had fallen apart, and still see the humanity behind it all. I could fight for justice without becoming bitter or numb. My trial record quickly became one of the strongest in the office. I prepared obsessively for every case. I studied every piece of evidence, anticipated every defense strategy, and presented arguments with both precision and emotional clarity. Jurors didn't just hear the legal facts, they understood what was truly at stake. I won cases that other prosecutors had quietly written off as unwinnable, because I refused to abandon children who had already been abandoned too many times. When a position opened for a magistrate judge in the Eastern District of Pennsylvania, several senior attorneys encouraged me to apply. At first I hesitated. I was only 35. Most magistrate judges had 10 or 15 more years of experience than I did. I worried that I hadn't earned that kind of responsibility yet. But my mentors insisted I submit my application. And when the selection committee reviewed my record, they saw something they believed the role required: legal skill combined with genuine compassion. I was appointed as one of the youngest magistrate judges in the district's history. The position carried enormous responsibility. I would preside over preliminary hearings, issue warrants, oversee certain civil matters, and make decisions that directly affected the lives of real people every single day. I never took that lightly. Behind every case file was a human story, often a painful one, and I reminded myself of that every time I stepped onto the bench. Yet no matter how demanding my career became, I never allowed it to consume everything. Arthur had taught me long ago that success meant very little if you forgot the people who mattered most. And he mattered more to me than anyone else in the world. As Arthur grew older, I made sure to stay present in his life. Twice a week I visited his house for dinner, sitting at the same kitchen table where he had once helped me with homework and listened patiently to my childhood dreams. Every evening I called him, even if only for 5 minutes, just to check in and hear his voice. Whenever he had medical appointments, I rearranged my schedule so I could go with him, sitting beside him in waiting rooms and asking the doctors the questions he sometimes hesitated to ask himself. When colleagues asked about my family, I always spoke about Arthur with unmistakable pride. "My dad saved my life," I would say simply, and I meant it in every possible way. I rarely mentioned my biological parents. That chapter of my life had long since closed. Arthur Bennett was my family, completely and without question. He was the only parent whose opinion mattered to me, the person whose approval I valued more than anyone else's. For years I had been quietly saving money with one specific plan in mind. When the day eventually came that Arthur could no longer live on his own, I would bring him to live with me. I would take care of him the same way he had taken care of me. It would never repay everything he had given me, but it would be a beginning. Our bond was the foundation of who I had become. Outside of my work and my relationship with Arthur, I also became deeply involved in my community. I volunteered at youth centers, speaking to teenagers about their rights, their futures, and the opportunities they deserved. I mentored young women entering law school, especially those who came from difficult backgrounds and needed someone to believe in them the way Arthur had once believed in me. Over time, people began recognizing me around the city, at grocery stores, coffee shops, community events. Sometimes someone would approach me to say thank you, to tell me about a case I had handled that had affected their family, or to express gratitude that someone in the legal system seemed to truly care. Families I had helped occasionally sent letters. I kept those letters in a folder in my office and read them whenever the work became emotionally overwhelming. I also donated to children's charities and served on nonprofit boards focused on foster care reform. Whenever I had the chance, I used whatever influence my position provided to advocate for better resources, better training for social workers, and better outcomes for vulnerable children. My colleagues often described me the same way: tough but fair. Someone whose compassion didn't weaken her judgment, but sharpened it. In many ways, I had become exactly who I had promised myself I would be. The person I had needed when I was 5 years old. I was living proof that trauma doesn't always create broken people. Sometimes it creates healers, protectors, advocates for those who cannot protect themselves. I had taken the worst thing that had ever happened to me and turned it into purpose. I had built a meaningful life, surrounded myself with people who valued integrity and compassion, and created a career devoted to ensuring that no child would ever feel as alone as I once had. For the first time in my life, I felt fulfilled in ways that little girl in the toy aisle could never have imagined. But even the strongest hearts can break. In early 2023, Arthur was diagnosed with stage 4 pancreatic cancer, and he kept it from me for 3 months. Looking back, I should have noticed the changes sooner. Arthur had always been energetic and present. Suddenly he seemed tired more often, slower, less interested in some of the things we used to enjoy together. Whenever I asked if something was wrong, he brushed the concern away with practiced ease. "Just a minor health issue," he would say. "Nothing to worry about. You know how it is when you get to my age." He refused to let me accompany him to doctor's appointments, insisting he could manage everything on his own. "You're in your first year as a judge," he reminded me. "You've got enough responsibility without worrying about my routine checkups." I accepted his explanations because I trusted him completely, because he had never lied to me before, and because I couldn't imagine that he would ever hide something serious from me. But that was exactly what he was doing. Arthur carried the knowledge of his terminal diagnosis alone. He endured increasing pain quietly, managing it with medications he took in private. When we met for our regular dinners, he forced himself to appear normal, smiling, listening, asking about my cases, all while his body was slowly failing, all while he knew the end was approaching. He did it, I later learned, because he remembered something I had almost forgotten. When I was younger, whenever Arthur traveled for business, I struggled with intense abandonment anxiety. I would call him again and again just to make sure he was safe. I couldn't sleep until he came home. Those fears had never fully disappeared. Arthur knew that. He believed that if I learned he was dying, it would reopen those old wounds, that it would send me spiraling back to that frightened 5-year-old girl standing alone in a toy aisle. So he tried to protect me the only way he knew how. He carried the burden himself. In his mind, keeping the truth from me was an act of mercy, not a deception that would one day haunt me. He didn't understand that I would have chosen something very different. I would have chosen to spend every remaining moment with him. I would have wanted to sit beside him through the hardest parts, not just the easy ones. But by the time the truth finally reached me, it was almost too late. In June 2023, Arthur entered hospice care. I didn't learn about it from him. I received a call from his longtime attorney, Jonathan Reed, who spoke in a quiet, urgent voice. "Arthur has been admitted to hospice," he told me. "You should come immediately." The drive to the hospice facility felt endless. My hands trembled on the steering wheel. My mind refused to fully accept what my heart already understood. When I finally walked into his room, the sight of him stole the air from my lungs. Arthur looked impossibly small in the hospital bed. The illness had reduced him to a fragile version of the man I had always known. His skin was pale and thin, his body weakened by months of pain I had never seen. But his eyes were the same. Still kind. Still gentle. The same eyes that had looked at me with quiet compassion in that mall cafe 30 years earlier. I took his hand and tried to be strong for him, the way he had always been strong for me. Each breath he took required visible effort. The hospice nurse quietly explained that he likely had hours, not days, left. The morphine would make it difficult for him to stay conscious or communicate clearly, so I sat beside him and said everything I needed him to hear. "You saved my life," I whispered. "You're the best father anyone could have asked for. I love you more than I'll ever be able to explain." For a while, he seemed to drift in and out of awareness. Then suddenly his eyes opened again, focusing on me with surprising clarity. His fingers tightened weakly around my hand. "Catherine," he managed, his voice barely audible. "There's something I need to tell you." He struggled for breath. "I always knew they would." The effort exhausted him. His voice faded. I leaned closer, bringing my ear near his mouth, desperate to hear what he was trying to say. "What, Dad?" I whispered. "What did you know?" But the moment had passed. His eyes slowly closed again. His breathing became irregular, shallow. I watched his chest rise once more. I held my breath, waiting for the next inhale. It never came. The silence that followed felt deafening. Arthur Bennett was gone, and I would never know what he had been trying to tell me. That unfinished sentence haunted me immediately. I always knew they would. They would what? Come back? Find me? Try something? For weeks afterward, I replayed those words in my mind, trying to decipher the warning he had tried to leave behind. I had no idea that he had predicted the exact crisis that was about to enter my life. I arranged his funeral according to the instructions he had left with Jonathan Reed. He had requested something simple, no spectacle, no elaborate ceremony, just a quiet farewell. Fewer than 20 people attended. Most were colleagues from my work. A few of Arthur's neighbors came. Jonathan Reed stood near the front, his expression heavy with the kind of sadness that comes from losing someone you have known for decades. When it was my turn to speak, I stood before the small gathering and tried to keep my voice steady. "My father taught me that love is a choice you make every single day," I said, looking at the simple casket that held the man who had given me everything. "He chose me when no one else would. He chose me every day for 30 years. And I will spend the rest of my life honoring that choice." I had brought something with me to place inside the casket. Mr. Hoppy, the worn stuffed rabbit I had clutched on the day Arthur first spoke to me in the mall. I had kept it all those years in the back of my closet, a quiet reminder of where my life had begun. It felt right that it should go with him now. Arthur had saved the little girl who once held that rabbit. Now the rabbit would stay with him. The funeral ended quietly. People offered condolences, shared brief memories, and gradually drifted away. I stayed longer than anyone else. I stood beside the grave as the workers prepared to lower the casket, not ready to walk away from the only father I had ever known. When I finally returned home, the silence inside the house felt overwhelming. Too still, too empty. I had lost the one person who had always been there. The grief was complete and consuming, but I still had my work, my purpose, the life Arthur had helped me build. I promised myself I would continue forward. I would honor him by doing the work he had always believed in. What I didn't know was that everything was about to change. Months passed in a blur of grief and routine. I threw myself into my responsibilities on the bench, allowing the structure of the courtroom to give shape to days that otherwise felt hollow. For the first time in 30 years, I spent holidays alone. Every Sunday I visited Arthur's grave, bringing fresh flowers and talking to him about my week. Cases I had handled, small updates about my life, the ordinary conversations we used to have at dinner. In January 2024, 6 months after his death, Jonathan Reed called again. He asked me to come to his office for the formal reading of Arthur's will. I had expected that moment eventually. Arthur had mentioned years earlier that he had arranged everything to be simple for me, that I shouldn't worry about complicated estate issues. I assumed there would be the house, maybe some savings, perhaps a few personal items he wanted distributed to friends. I was completely unprepared for what Jonathan Reed revealed that afternoon. The reading took place in a conference room lined with dark wood panels and heavy leather chairs. Several people I didn't recognize were already seated there. Representatives from charitable organizations, Jonathan explained. He sat at the head of the table with Arthur's will in front of him. Before he began reading, he looked around the room and spoke carefully. "What I'm about to reveal," he said, "may come as a surprise to everyone present." He glanced toward me, "Most of all to you, Catherine." The man I had known as a modest, quiet father, who clipped coupons and drove a 15-year-old sedan, had been something else entirely. Arthur Bennett had been extraordinarily wealthy, not comfortable, not well off, wealthy beyond anything I had ever imagined. Jonathan explained that in the early 1980s, Arthur had quietly been the silent co-founder of a technology startup, one of the early companies working on computer networking systems that would later become foundational to the infrastructure of the Internet. Arthur had provided both the original funding and key technical expertise, but he had deliberately stayed out of the spotlight, preferring to work quietly behind the scenes while others took the public roles. When the company was sold in the late 1990s, Arthur Bennett's share of the payout had been worth hundreds of millions of dollars. He didn't spend it recklessly. Instead, he invested the money carefully and conservatively, letting it grow quietly over the next 2 decades. By the time of his death, his total estate was valued at more than $40 million. The number felt unreal. I sat frozen in the leather chair in Jonathan Reed's conference room, staring at him as he spoke, unable to fully process what I was hearing. Arthur's friends who had visited his small 2-bedroom house looked stunned. Neighbors who had watched him clip coupons and shop at discount stores seemed almost speechless. For decades, Arthur had lived like a modest middle-class retiree while sitting on generational wealth, and he had done it entirely on purpose. Jonathan explained that Arthur had wanted me to grow up normally, free from the distortions and complications that immense wealth could bring. He wanted me to develop my own work ethic, my own values, my own sense of purpose. He wanted my life to be shaped by character, not by money. As the will reading continued, I learned that most of Arthur's estate had been donated to charitable organizations. Many of them focused specifically on child welfare and foster care reform. There were funds for legal organizations that represented children in custody battles, programs that supported foster families, initiatives designed to reform adoption systems and protect vulnerable kids. Arthur had structured the donations carefully, creating long-term endowments that would continue supporting those causes long after both of us were gone. But there was one personal bequest, and when Jonathan Reed read it aloud, I had to press my hand over my mouth to stop myself from sobbing. To my beloved daughter, Catherine O'Hara, I leave the sum of $4 million. Not because this amount reflects her value to me, her value is immeasurable, but because it represents her age of 32 when I last updated this document. May she use it to build the life she deserves, knowing that every opportunity she has achieved came through her own merit, her compassion, and her strength. She required nothing from me but love, and that I gave freely. Now I give her this not as charity, but as a celebration of the extraordinary woman she became, despite the cruelty of those who should have cherished her. The amount wasn't random, it was deliberate, a final message written in numbers. 32. The age I had been when he last revised the will, the moment he had formally decided how he would continue caring for me even after he was gone. Through tears, I listened as Jonathan finished reading the remaining provisions. The will made no mention of my biological parents. Arthur had known exactly what they had done, and he had ensured they would have no legal claim to anything he left behind. Even in death, he had protected me. But because Arthur's estate was so large, and because so much of it had been donated to charitable causes, the will quickly attracted media attention. Local news stations picked up the story. They framed it as a human interest piece, something uplifting to balance the usual reports of tragedy and conflict. The broadcast described the reclusive tech investor who had quietly lived like an ordinary citizen, all while sitting on a fortune. They showed photographs of Arthur and me together. One image from my law school graduation appeared repeatedly on screen. Arthur standing beside me in his simple suit, his face filled with unmistakable pride. Legal experts were interviewed about the unusual structure of the will. Commentators spoke about the significance of the $4 million inheritance. The story quickly turned into something bigger than either of us. Reporters called it a modern fairy tale, a man who rescued an abandoned child, a child who grew up to become a judge, a legacy of generosity that had changed countless lives. The story aired on evening news broadcasts across multiple states. What had begun as a private moment of grief suddenly became public knowledge. Journalists described me as the adopted daughter who had inherited millions from the man who had saved her life. They called it a beautiful ending to a story that had begun with abandonment. I hated the attention, but I understood it was inevitable once Arthur's generosity became part of the public record. I gave one brief statement thanking the media for their interest and asking for privacy while I continued to process the loss of my father. Then I tried to return to my life, back to my work, back to the quiet rhythm of the courtroom, back to the grief that still followed me everywhere. What I didn't know was that hundreds of miles away, two people were watching that same broadcast, and their reaction was nothing like the warm admiration the reporters had hoped to inspire. In a cluttered living room roughly 60 miles away in Reading, Pennsylvania, the television flickered with the evening news. Michael and Linda O'Hara were eating dinner on the couch, a habit formed years earlier when meaningful conversation between them had quietly disappeared. Their living room told its own story. Stacks of unopened mail covered the coffee table, most of them bills and final notices printed in urgent red ink. A foreclosure warning from the bank hung on the refrigerator door. Empty beer cans sat beside Michael's chair. In the corner of the room, shopping bags from Linda's latest spending spree overflowed with items they couldn't afford. The house felt heavy with the weight of years of bad decisions. The local evening news was playing in the background while Michael and Linda O'Hara ate their microwave dinners from mismatched plates. It was the kind of program they only half paid attention to, just noise filling the room while they avoided talking to each other. Then a segment began about a local judge who had recently inherited millions from her adoptive father, a reclusive tech investor who had lived quietly for decades. Linda was halfway through a bite of food when the reporter said a name. Catherine O'Hara. She nearly choked. Coughing violently, she reached for her glass of water while Michael absent-mindedly patted her back. But suddenly, Linda stopped coughing. She was staring at the television. A photograph appeared on the screen. A woman wearing judicial robes, composed and confident. Her expression was calm, her dark eyes focused. Eyes Linda recognized immediately, even after 30 years. "Turn it up," she whispered. Michael grabbed the remote and raised the volume. The reporter continued. Judge Catherine O'Hara inherited $4 million from Arthur Bennett, the man who adopted her after she was found abandoned in a mall in Pennsylvania in 1993. The words seemed to hang in the air. The year, the mall, the circumstances, every detail aligned with sickening precision. Linda slowly lowered her fork onto the plate. Her hand trembled slightly. "That's her," she said quietly. "That's our daughter." She didn't say it with shock, or guilt, or the painful realization that the child they had abandoned had somehow survived. She said it with calculation, with the tone of someone recognizing something valuable they had once misplaced. Michael stared at the screen. The accomplished woman in judicial robes looked nothing like the 5-year-old girl he had last seen through the glass windows of King of Prussia Mall. For a moment he said nothing. Then he looked at Linda. And in that brief exchange of eye contact, an entire conversation passed silently between them. Not regret, not remorse, not even curiosity about the life their daughter had lived. Opportunity. Their financial situation had deteriorated far beyond ordinary trouble. It was catastrophic. They owed $47,000 in credit card debt, accumulated through years of living far beyond their means. They were 3 months behind on their mortgage, and the bank had already issued multiple warnings that foreclosure proceedings would begin soon. A notice for car repossession sat among the stacks of unopened mail on their coffee table. And Michael's gambling debts, the ones owed to people who didn't send polite reminders or negotiate payment plans, were the most urgent of all. They had exhausted every option. Linda's sister had refused to lend them more money after they failed to repay the last loan. Debt consolidation companies had rejected their applications. Refinancing their house was impossible with their damaged credit and lack of equity. Bankruptcy loomed on the horizon, threatening to take their home and the last scraps of stability in their daughter Emily's life. And then this news broadcast appeared. To them, it felt like an answer to prayers they had never been righteous enough to speak aloud. Their daughter, the one they had abandoned 30 years earlier, was now wealthy. Not simply comfortable. Wealthy. Millions of dollars wealthy. They didn't see Catherine as the child they had wronged. They didn't remember the frightened little girl they had left behind. They saw an asset, something they had once possessed and might be able to claim again if they played their cards correctly. The mental gymnastics began almost immediately. They convinced themselves they had rights. After all, they were her biological parents. Didn't blood matter? Hadn't they suffered too? In their own way, living with the memory of that day? Didn't they deserve something for that pain? And Arthur Bennett? Well, perhaps he had taken advantage of the situation. Perhaps he had interfered with a confused child and manipulated the legal system. That was a story they could tell, and if they told it the right way, maybe people would believe it. Within 48 hours, they contacted a lawyer, Gregory Walsh, a personal injury attorney whose billboards promised maximum compensation for your suffering, and whose reputation suggested he was willing to take almost any case if the payout might be large enough. Before meeting him, Michael and Linda carefully rehearsed their story. They coordinated the details. They practiced the emotions they would display. They refined the version of events that would sound the most sympathetic. When they sat across from Gregory Walsh in his office, they presented themselves as devastated parents whose child had been separated from them in a crowded mall decades earlier. They claimed Arthur Bennett had taken advantage of the confusion, inserting himself into a situation that should have ended with their daughter being returned to them. They insisted they had searched for Catherine for years. They claimed the system had failed them, prioritizing the adoptive parent over the biological family. Walsh listened carefully, his expression neutral. Years of legal practice had taught him not to show skepticism too quickly. In truth, he knew the story was weak, the timeline didn't quite fit, and any experienced opposing attorney could dismantle their narrative in minutes. But Walsh also understood something else. Inheritance disputes were emotional, messy, and often settled quietly to avoid negative publicity. He didn't need to win the case on legal merit. He only needed to apply enough pressure that Judge Catherine O'Hara might choose to settle rather than endure a prolonged, humiliating court battle. 3 weeks after the news broadcast, they filed a lawsuit. The complaint accused Arthur Bennett of wrongful adoption, violation of parental rights, intentional interference with family relationships, and emotional distress. They demanded the entire $4 million inheritance, plus additional damages for the suffering they claimed to have endured for 30 years. The lawsuit was shameless, legally questionable, ethically indefensible, but it was just credible enough to force the matter into court, just credible enough to drag me back into contact with the people who had taught me what abandonment felt like, and just credible enough to threaten everything Arthur had spent 30 years trying to protect me from. And soon their message arrived. It came in the form of a knock on my door. I returned home from the courthouse on a cold February evening, my mind still tangled in the details of a custody case I had spent the entire day overseeing. It had been emotionally exhausting, one of those cases where a mother was fighting desperately to regain custody of children who had been removed from her home because of substance abuse. All afternoon I had listened to testimony, weighed evidence, and tried to determine what outcome would truly serve the children's best interests. Cases like that rarely stayed behind in the courtroom. They followed me home, lingering in my thoughts long after the hearings ended. Usually, I welcomed the quiet of my empty house after days like that. But that evening, the house was not quiet. A man stood on my front step, shifting from foot to foot against the winter cold. He looked as though he had been waiting for some time. He wore a jacket with an official badge clipped near the collar. I recognized the look immediately. A process server. I had seen enough of them throughout my career to know exactly what that meant. "Catherine O'Hara?" he asked, though it was clear he already knew the answer. "Yes," I replied. He handed me a thick manila envelope with the practiced politeness of someone who had delivered unpleasant news many times before. "Have a good evening," he said quietly. I thanked him automatically, professional habit formed after years in the legal system, then stepped inside. At first, I assumed the envelope was work-related. Perhaps paperwork requiring my signature. Maybe a subpoena connected to one of my old cases from my time as a prosecutor. I placed my briefcase on the counter, slipped off my gloves, and opened the envelope at the kitchen table while still wearing my coat. The document inside was heavy, formally bound. At the top of the first page was a case caption printed in bold legal type. I read the names, and every ounce of warmth drained from my body. Michael O'Hara and Linda O'Hara versus Catherine O'Hara. My knees weakened. I had to sit down. Slowly, I lowered myself into the kitchen chair, staring at those names I had not seen or spoken in 30 years. Names I had worked very hard never to think about. Names I had locked away in a chapter of my life that I believed was permanently closed. And now they were printed on official court documents, reaching across 3 decades to pull me back into their world. The complaint was 43 pages long. My hands trembled slightly as I began reading, though years of legal training forced my mind to remain analytical. But the deeper I read, the sicker I felt. The document described a version of history so brazenly dishonest it was almost surreal. Michael and Linda portrayed themselves as loving parents whose daughter had been momentarily separated from them in the chaos of a crowded mall. According to their narrative, Arthur Bennett had taken advantage of the confusion, essentially abducting me while they searched desperately through the building. They described themselves as victims of a flawed system that had allowed their daughter to be stolen from them. They claimed they had spent 30 years grieving, 30 years searching, 30 years living with unanswered questions. The lawsuit demanded the full $4 million inheritance, plus additional damages for emotional distress, interference with family relationships, and what they called wrongful adoption. They claimed Arthur had obtained custody through fraudulent means. They claimed the adoption had never been legitimate. They claimed that I had benefited financially from what they described as my own kidnapping. The accusations were absurd, they were offensive, and worst of all, they were real. I sat at the kitchen table as darkness slowly settled outside the windows. Again and again I reread the complaint, unable to stop even though each paragraph felt like a fresh wound. Every sentence twisted the truth a little further. Every claim turned the worst day of my childhood into a story where they were the victims. That night, I didn't sleep. Every time I closed my eyes, I was 5 years old again, standing in the toy section, counting to 60, watching my parents walk away. All the trauma I thought I had long since processed, through therapy, through building a career, through the love Arthur had given me, came rushing back with unexpected force. For the first time since Arthur's funeral, I cried. But these tears were different. Not the quiet grief of losing someone I loved. These were tears of anger, of betrayal, of deep, unresolved pain. How dare they? For 30 years they had never once tried to find me, never once asked whether I was safe, never once cared enough to wonder if I had survived. And now, after decades of silence, suddenly they remembered I existed. But even in that moment of fury, I understood something clearly. They didn't want me. They wanted the money. They wanted what I had inherited from the man who had actually loved me, the man who had chosen me, the man who had been there every single day. To them, I was simply a resource, an asset that had finally become valuable. 30 years ago, they had discarded me like a burden. Now they wanted to reclaim me like property. It was abandonment all over again. The first time they had left me physically. This time they were making something equally clear, that I had never truly been their daughter. I had only been something they created, something they believed they could claim again when it became financially convenient. But as the night passed and the shock slowly faded, something else began to replace my grief. Resolve. The anger sharpened into something colder, more focused, more dangerous. I was no longer the frightened child standing alone in a toy aisle. I was a judge, a former prosecutor, a woman who had spent her entire career fighting for justice and protecting the vulnerable. And I would not be victimized by the same people twice. By the time dawn arrived, I already knew what I needed to do. I called David Parker, a former colleague from my years as a prosecutor. Over time, he had moved into estate litigation and built a reputation for something very simple. He didn't lose cases he believed in. We had remained friends over the years, occasionally meeting for coffee to talk about legal developments or swap stories from our different corners of the legal world. He answered on the second ring. "David," I said. My voice was hoarse from a night without sleep, but steady with purpose. "I need your help." "What's going on?" "I'm being sued," I said, "by my biological parents. They're trying to claim the inheritance Arthur left me." There was a brief silence on the line. Then David spoke again, his voice firm. "I'll represent you pro bono." "No," I replied immediately. "This isn't charity. I'm paying your full rate." "Catherine, this is about principle." "Yes," I interrupted gently, "and because of that, it has to be done the right way, completely above board. They're going to try to twist everything. I want this handled professionally from start to finish." David paused for a moment. Then he sighed softly. "All right," he said. "Full rate it is, but we're going to win this." We scheduled a meeting later that week to begin preparing my defense. The court date was set for August 2024. Because I was a federal magistrate judge in the Eastern District of Pennsylvania, the case was transferred to another federal district to avoid any conflict of interest. 6 months away. 6 months to gather evidence. 6 months to build a case so airtight that their lies would collapse under their own weight. They had dragged me into court, believing I was still the frightened child they had abandoned decades earlier. They had no idea who I had become since then, and they had no idea what they had just started. Over the next 4 months, I became an investigator of my own past. Every evening after court, I returned home and turned my dining room into a war room. Documents covered the table: school records, police reports, medical files, timelines of events stretching back more than 30 years. I began with my elementary school records from 1988 to 1993, requesting them from the school I had attended before the abandonment. When the files arrived, the contents were worse than I had expected. Multiple teachers had written notes expressing concern about my well-being. One report described how I frequently arrived at school hungry, wearing clothing that was either dirty or inappropriate for the weather. Another teacher had documented unexplained bruises on my arms during the spring of 1992. One note described me as withdrawn and fearful, mentioning that I had flinched when the teacher raised her hand to point at the chalkboard. Next, I obtained my childhood medical records, using legal access available through my professional credentials. There were 3 emergency room visits before I had turned 5. A broken wrist my parents claimed happened when I fell off a swing. A concussion they said came from me walking into a door. Burns on my hand they explained as the result of touching a hot stove after being warned not to. But the doctor's notes told a different story. Several entries contained careful phrases medical professionals use when they suspect abuse but lack definitive proof. Injury inconsistent with stated cause. Possible non-accidental trauma. Reading those words made my hands shake. Then I requested the original police report from King of Prussia Mall in 1993, a document I had never seen before. Inside were witness statements that made my stomach turn. One statement came from a mall employee who had approached my parents in the parking lot. Her report read, "I asked if they had forgotten a child inside the store. The man waved me off and said no. The woman said no, no one with us. They didn't appear concerned or confused. They simply left." I continued digging. Through legal discovery channels, I obtained bank records showing that Michael and Linda O'Hara had never hired a private investigator. They had never made donations to missing children organizations. They had never posted reward notices. They had never spent money on advertising or search efforts. There were no expenses consistent with parents desperately trying to find a missing child. Instead, the financial records revealed something else. Regular casino withdrawals, credit card charges for shopping sprees. Every document told the same story from a different angle. They hadn't lost me. They had abandoned me, deliberately, and for 30 years they had never once tried to undo it, until the moment I became financially valuable. But during my research into their lives through public records, I discovered something that stopped me cold. A birth certificate filed in October 1996. The record listed a child born to Michael and Linda O'Hara. Emily Elizabeth O'Hara. I had a sister. The realization left me sitting silently at the table for several minutes. 3 years after abandoning me, my parents had simply started over. They had replaced me. While I was building a life with Arthur Bennett, they had created a new family that had nothing to do with me. Curiosity, and something deeper, pushed me to learn more. Using professional databases and public records, I began researching Emily. She had graduated from a nearby state university with a degree in elementary education. She worked as a 4th-grade teacher at a public school in Reading, Pennsylvania. By all appearances, she lived a quiet, ordinary life. Nothing in the records suggested the chaos and neglect that had defined my own early childhood. Eventually, I found her social media accounts. They weren't private. That evening, I sat at my desk scrolling through years of photographs. Family holidays, school events, snapshots of everyday life. For the first time, I was looking at the face of the sister I had never known. She had my eyes, the same deep brown that looked almost black in certain light. She had my smile too, the slight crookedness on one side that I had always thought was uniquely mine. Emily posted pictures of her classroom, photos of colorful student artwork taped to bulletin boards, little updates about lesson plans and parent-teacher conferences. She looked warm and approachable, the kind of teacher children trusted and parents appreciated. There were also pictures of her with Michael and Linda O'Hara at holidays and birthdays, Emily hugging Linda in front of a Christmas tree. Emily and Michael sitting together at what looked like a restaurant celebration. In every photo, they appeared like a normal family, functional, intact, ordinary. Those images twisted something deep inside my chest. The emotions were tangled and difficult to separate. Part of me felt anger that they had kept one daughter but discarded the other, that they had been capable of raising a child, just not willing to raise me. Part of me felt an unexpected flicker of jealousy that Emily had grown up with the family I had been denied. And yet, at the same time, I felt a strange sense of gratitude that Arthur Bennett had rescued me from whatever kind of childhood I might have endured if I had stayed. But above all, I felt something else. Protectiveness. Emily was an innocent person caught inside a story she didn't know was false. She had spent her entire life believing something that wasn't true. When I showed the information to David Parker, he immediately advised against contacting her. It could complicate the case, he warned during one of our strategy meetings. If you reach out now, their lawyer will argue you're trying to manipulate witnesses or interfere with their family relationships. Wait until the trial is over. Legally, he was absolutely right. But when I looked at Emily's photographs, I wasn't thinking like a lawyer. I was thinking like the older sister I had never been. I wanted to protect her. For 28 years, Emily had been raised on a fabricated story about a kidnapped sister, a tragedy that had never actually happened. She deserved to know the truth, didn't she? But telling her would destroy the foundation of her entire life, her understanding of her parents, her childhood, her identity as the daughter who remained while the other had been stolen away. All of it would collapse under the weight of reality. And I didn't know if I had the right to do that. Was it my place to shatter her world, even if that world had been built on lies? In the end, I decided to wait. I didn't want Emily dragged into a legal battle she hadn't asked for. I didn't want her feeling pressured to choose sides before the truth had been formally established. But I saved everything, every photograph, every piece of information. I created a folder on my computer labeled simply, Emily. When the trial was finished, when the truth had been proven, I would reach out to her. Because real family, the kind Arthur had taught me about, told each other the truth, even when that truth hurt. Emily deserved that honesty. What I didn't know was that Emily was already beginning to ask questions of her own. While I was gathering evidence and preparing for court, her world was already starting to crack. And it didn't begin with me. It began with an accident, an overheard conversation that neither of us could have predicted. Emily visited her parents every Sunday for dinner. It was a routine she had maintained faithfully ever since graduating college and moving into her own apartment. She was the kind of daughter who called regularly, who showed up with groceries when she knew money was tight. In late July, she arrived carrying 2 heavy bags of food she had purchased with her teacher's salary, things she knew her parents needed but wouldn't buy for themselves. As she stepped onto the porch, she heard raised voices coming from inside the house. Her parents rarely argued loudly enough for neighbors to hear. The volume alone made her pause with her hand halfway to the doorbell. Through the living room window, she could see them inside. Her father gesturing sharply, her mother trying to quiet him. Then she heard Michael's voice clearly through the thin walls. "Once we get that money from her, we can finally stop pretending we care." Linda snapped back immediately. "Keep your voice down. Sarah will be here any minute." Emily froze. The grocery bags pressed painfully into her palms as her stomach dropped. Something in her father's tone, something cold and calculating, made her blood run cold. Instead of ringing the doorbell, she quietly set the bags down on the porch. Then she moved silently around the side of the house toward a window that was partially open. What she heard in the next 5 minutes shattered 28 years of carefully constructed lies. Inside the living room, her parents discussed the lawsuit. They talked about the girl they left. They talked about making sure Emily never connected them to the story. They discussed strategies their lawyer had suggested, how they should answer questions in court. At one point, Linda said nervously, "What if Emily finds out we lied about everything?" Emily backed away from the window. Her heart pounded so loudly she was certain they would hear it. She grabbed the grocery bags, left them quietly by the front door, and walked back to her car on unsteady legs. The drive home passed in a blur. Her mind raced to make sense of what she had heard, even as part of her refused to accept the implications. That night she barely slept. Emily was a fourth-grade teacher. Her job required her to recognize when children were lying or hiding something. She knew the signs: inconsistent stories, defensive reactions to simple questions, strange nervousness whenever certain topics came up. For years, she had used those instincts to help identify children who needed help or protection. Now she turned those same instincts toward her own family. She began replaying memories through a new lens. All the times she had asked about Catherine, the sister who had supposedly been kidnapped, and received vague, rehearsed answers. The way her parents discouraged her whenever she tried to read about missing children cases. The absence of photographs of her lost sister. The way they used that tragedy to explain everything, every financial problem, every emotional distance, every strange tension in their home. The next Sunday, Emily returned, but this time she came with questions. During dinner, she watched their reactions carefully and asked in a quiet voice, "Whatever happened with Catherine, my sister? The one who was taken?" Her father's face hardened immediately. "Why are you bringing this up now?" Michael's reaction was immediate and defensive, far stronger than the simple question deserved. Linda quickly stepped in with the familiar story they had told for years. But this time, Emily listened differently. She listened with suspicion instead of trust. And suddenly the cracks were obvious. The details shifted from what she remembered hearing before. The name of the mall changed slightly. The year sounded uncertain. Their descriptions of the frantic search were emotional but strangely vague, full of feeling, empty of facts. That night, Emily sat in front of her laptop and began searching. She typed, "Catherine O'Hara abandoned 1993 into the search bar. Within seconds, articles appeared, old newspaper archives she had never known existed, stories about a 5-year-old girl found alone inside King of Prussia Mall, reports about a police investigation, a local man named Arthur Bennett who later adopted the child, and one crucial detail repeated in every article. The case had never been classified as a kidnapping. From the beginning, it had been ruled abandonment. Emily dug deeper. A true crime blogger had uploaded the original police report years earlier. She opened the document and began reading. Witness statements from mall employees. One employee describing how he approached the couple in the parking lot and asked if they had forgotten a child inside. The man waved him off. The woman said, "No, no one with us." Security footage timestamps showing they left the building 4 minutes after entering the toy section. And perhaps most damning of all, there had never been a missing person report filed by Michael and Linda O'Hara. Emily sat frozen in her apartment as the truth settled over her like falling ice. The story she had been told her entire life didn't just contain mistakes. It was the complete opposite of what had happened. In early August, only weeks before the trial, Emily sat staring at the phone number she had found online for Judge Catherine O'Hara's chambers. She had rehearsed what she would say 100 times, but her hand still trembled when she dialed. A professional voice answered. "Judge O'Hara's office." Emily almost hung up. The words caught in her throat, but she forced them out. "I need to leave a message for Judge O'Hara. It's personal." A pause, then she said quietly, "Please tell her Emily O'Hara called. Her sister." The clerk's tone shifted slightly. "I'll make sure she receives the message. Can I have a number where she can reach you?" Emily gave her cell phone number and hung up immediately, her heart pounding. What if Catherine didn't want to hear from her? What if she blamed Emily for being the daughter their parents kept? What if... Her phone rang that evening. An unfamiliar number. Emily answered with a shaky voice. "Hello?" A careful voice replied. "Emily?" "Yes. This is Catherine." Emily closed her eyes as tears filled them. "Is it really you?" There was a long silence. "Yes," Catherine said gently. The conversation that followed was brief. Both of them were too overwhelmed for anything more. Emily asked the question that had been haunting her since that night on the porch. "Did they really abandon you?" On purpose? Catherine didn't answer immediately. The silence stretched long enough to say everything. Finally, she said quietly, "Yes, and I can prove it." Something inside Emily cracked. "I need to see you," she whispered. "I need to know the truth, all of it." They agreed to meet the next day at a coffee shop halfway between their cities. The cafe sat between our two towns, a neutral place that felt strangely appropriate. I arrived first and chose a booth where I could see the entrance. My hands were wrapped around a cup of coffee I hadn't touched. My stomach was too tight for caffeine. When Emily walked through the door, I knew her instantly. The resemblance struck like a physical impact. She had my eyes. The same deep brown that almost looked black in certain lighting. She had my height, my slim build. And when she nervously tucked her hair behind her left ear while scanning the room, I felt something strange and unsettling. I did that exact same gesture. Our eyes met. Emily burst into tears. Not quiet tears, full sobs that made people turn and stare. She hurried toward me. I stood up. We hugged awkwardly. Two strangers who should have been sisters. Two women connected by blood and trauma, yet with no shared childhood to bind us together. When we finally sat down, Emily whispered through tears, "You look like me." I gave a small, sad smile. "Or maybe you look like me." She laughed weakly. "I never imagined." "I know," I said softly. "I only found out about you a few months ago. I was planning to reach out after the trial." For the next 2 hours, I told her everything. The mall, the toy aisle, the moment our mother looked back at me, not with panic, but with cold certainty. Arthur finding me, taking me home, raising me. The cameras that had recorded everything, the evidence I had gathered. I opened my laptop and showed her the documents, the police report, the witness statements, the timeline showing our parents left the building within 4 minutes, school reports documenting neglect, medical records suggesting abuse. Emily read silently. Her expression moved through disbelief, horror, anger, grief. Several times she started to say, "But they told me," then stopped when she realized the story she had believed her whole life was collapsing. Finally, she leaned back in her chair, pale. My entire childhood was built on fiction. Everything I believed about our family, about myself, it was all a lie. I reached across the table and gently took her hand. "You were a victim too, Emily. They lied to you. They used you as part of the cover story." She shook her head slowly, tears running down her face. "I should have questioned it more. There were so many things that didn't make sense. I just wanted to believe I had parents who lost a child, not parents capable of abandoning one." Emily left that cafe looking like someone whose entire world had shifted. But she didn't simply accept my version of events. She needed proof. So she hired a private investigator using money she had been saving for a house down payment. Within 2 weeks, the investigator uncovered things even I hadn't known. Old neighbors remembered my father's violent temper, the shouting, things breaking inside the house. They remembered my mother leaving me alone for hours. One neighbor recalled calling Child Protective Services after seeing me locked outside during winter without a coat. But the most devastating discovery came from financial records. In 1994, 1 year after abandoning me, my father had taken out a missing child insurance policy. In 1995, he cashed it, declaring me presumed dead. The payout wasn't small. Bank statements showed exactly how they spent the money. A trip to Las Vegas, new furniture. They had literally profited from abandoning me. The investigator also uncovered records of my father's gambling addiction, years of losses at casinos, and shoplifting charges against my mother from 3 different stores. When Emily called me to share what she'd learned, her voice sounded completely different. Stronger, colder. The voice of someone who had stopped doubting the truth. The uncertainty in her voice had disappeared. What remained was something colder, steadier. "I found things," Emily said quietly over the phone. "Terrible things. And I need to know." Are you really going to fight them in court? Yes, I answered. The trial is in 2 weeks. I've hired a lawyer, Marcus Chen. We're going to present the evidence and expose everything they've done. Emily drew a shaky breath. Then I want to testify. No, I said immediately. Emily, you don't have to do that. I don't want you damaging your relationship with your parents because of me. They're not my parents. Her voice cut through the line, firm and unshakable. They're people who lied to me for 28 years. They abandoned their daughter and then used her disappearance as an excuse for every failure in their lives. She paused, and when she spoke again, her voice softened slightly. You're my sister. You're the one they hurt the most. But they hurt me too. They made me part of their lie without even knowing it. I'm not staying silent. Tears filled my eyes. In 35 years of life, only one person, Arthur, had ever chosen me when choosing me was inconvenient. Are you sure? I asked quietly. I'm sure, Emily replied. Besides, someone has to protect you. That's what big sisters do, right? I laughed softly through the tears. I'm the older sister. I'm 35. You're 28. Then I guess, Emily said gently, we protect each other. Over the next week, Marcus prepared Emily for her testimony. He walked her through every possible scenario, how cross-examination would work, how to remain calm if their lawyer tried to intimidate her, how to present evidence clearly and credibly. Marcus admitted privately that her decision to testify changed the entire shape of the case. It was no longer just documents and records. Now it was their own daughter standing up in court to say their story was a lie. August 15th, 2024. The date had been circled on my calendar for 6 months. I arrived at the courthouse with Marcus, both of us carrying briefcases packed with evidence. The morning air was warm and heavy, and despite my effort to stay calm, I could feel sweat gathering beneath my collar. I had walked these courthouse halls countless times before, but never like this. This time I wasn't here as a prosecutor, and I wasn't here as a judge. I was here as a defendant. As we approached the courtroom doors, I saw them. Michael and Linda O'Hara stood near the entrance beside their lawyer. Seeing them again after 30 years felt surreal. Time had changed them. They looked older, grayer, smaller somehow than the towering figures they had been in my childhood memories. Linda wore a poorly fitted black dress clearly meant to suggest mourning. Michael looked uncomfortable in a cheap suit with a tie knotted far too tightly. But it wasn't their appearance that struck me. It was their expressions. There was no shame, no hesitation, no trace of regret. They looked at me the way someone studies an item at an auction, evaluating value. Linda whispered something to Michael while staring at me. He nodded. A faint smirk crossed his face. They weren't here to reconnect with a daughter they had lost. They were here to collect payment. The realization settled over me with icy clarity. They had never changed. They had never regretted what they did, and they didn't deserve mercy now. I straightened my shoulders, lifted my chin, and walked past them without a word. Exactly the way they had walked past me 30 years earlier, as if I didn't exist. Inside the courtroom, Marcus and I took our seats at the defense table. The room slowly filled with spectators. Several journalists were already present, notebooks open. Emily sat quietly in the gallery. Seeing her there filled me with a mix of comfort and anxiety. She hadn't needed to come this early, but she wanted to show support from the beginning. A few moments later, the courtroom doors opened again. All rise. Judge Margaret Anderson entered. She was an older woman with calm eyes and a reputation for fairness that every attorney respected. We all stood as she took her seat behind the bench. The courtroom fell silent. No one realized yet that this trial was about to reveal far more than a simple inheritance dispute. It was about to expose 30 years of lies. And before the day ended, the people who abandoned a child in a toy aisle would finally face the truth they had spent decades running from. I had appeared before Judge Margaret Anderson once before during my time as a prosecutor, and I remembered being impressed by her balance of compassion and discipline. She had a reputation for fairness, but also for refusing to tolerate manipulation or theatrics in her courtroom. Knowing she was presiding over this case gave me a quiet sense of relief. My parents' attorney, Lawrence Preston, rose to deliver his opening statement. Preston was in his early 60s, silver-haired, polished, and clearly experienced in front of a jury or judge. The way he began speaking was calm and deliberate, drawing the room into his story. If someone had walked in without knowing the facts, they might have believed every word. He described Michael and Linda O'Hara as devastated parents who had lived for 3 decades with unimaginable grief. He spoke of a child who had vanished in a crowded mall, of frantic searching and sleepless nights, of years spent wondering whether their daughter was alive or dead. Then he shifted his attention to Arthur Bennett. According to Preston's narrative, Arthur had taken advantage of a chaotic situation, removing a child from her parents while they were desperately trying to locate her. He suggested the adoption process had failed to verify the biological parents' rights properly. The inheritance Ms. O'Hara received, Preston said, allowing his voice to tremble slightly, is built upon a fraudulent foundation. He paused dramatically. My clients never consented to the adoption of their daughter. They never stopped searching for her. They never stopped loving her. The room was silent. And now, Preston continued, gesturing toward me, after decades of grief and uncertainty, they discover that their daughter is not only alive, but has inherited millions from the man who took her from them. He lowered his voice. My clients are not here out of greed. They are here seeking justice, seeking restitution for 30 years of loss, suffering, and a system that failed them. It was a powerful performance. I could see several spectators in the gallery shifting uneasily. A few of the journalists were writing quickly. Preston knew how to tell a story, but then something happened that changed everything. While emphasizing his point about the stolen daughter, Preston turned toward our table and gestured in my direction. His eyes landed on the nameplate in front of Marcus. Then they moved to the placard identifying me. For a moment, Preston froze. The color drained from his face. His mouth remained open mid-sentence as he stared down at the placard again. Then he looked at me. Then at Judge Anderson. His composure shattered. Your Honor, he said suddenly, his voice no longer smooth but strained. May I approach the bench? Judge Anderson nodded. Marcus leaned slightly toward me with the faintest smile. He understood immediately what was happening. Preston hurried to the bench and began speaking in a low, urgent whisper. I couldn't hear the words, but I saw Judge Anderson's expression shift, first surprise, then something that looked almost like respect. She glanced briefly at me, then she nodded. Preston returned to his table looking deeply unsettled. Judge Anderson adjusted her glasses and addressed the courtroom. For the record, she said clearly, the court acknowledges that the defendant, Catherine O'Hara, currently serves as a magistrate judge within this district. A ripple of whispers swept across the courtroom. My parents looked confused. Preston looked like a man who had just realized he had stepped onto a battlefield he hadn't fully understood. The journalists began scribbling furiously. Judge Anderson raised her hand, and the room gradually quieted. When she spoke again, her tone was calm but deliberate. Before we proceed, I want to ensure that all parties fully understand the nature of these proceedings. She leaned forward slightly. This court operates on evidence, not emotion. Her gaze moved slowly across the room. I recognize that this matter involves complex family dynamics. I also recognize that Judge O'Hara serves within our judicial system. Then she turned her attention directly to Preston. Mr. Preston, your clients have the right to withdraw their complaint at any time before testimony begins. She paused long enough for the meaning to settle. However, once witnesses are sworn and evidence is presented, the case will proceed to its conclusion. Her voice hardened slightly. There will be no interruption of proceedings simply because one party becomes dissatisfied with how the evidence unfolds. Anyone familiar with the legal system understood exactly what she was saying. This was Preston's last chance to walk away. I watched him carefully. He leaned toward my parents and whispered something urgently. I couldn't hear the words, but I could see his caution clearly. Linda's expression hardened immediately. Michael shook his head stubbornly. Linda whispered back, loud enough for me to catch fragments. Our rights. She owes us. They weren't thinking about evidence. They were thinking about money. Preston straightened slowly and faced the judge again. We will proceed, Your Honor. But the confidence he had displayed earlier was gone. The atmosphere in the courtroom shifted. The 30 or so spectators leaned forward in their seats. The journalists were watching intently now, sensing the story had become far bigger than an inheritance dispute. This wasn't just a family conflict anymore. This was a magistrate judge defending her entire life story against accusations that, if proven true, would destroy her career. My biological parents still didn't seem to understand what had changed. Linda leaned toward Michael and whispered loudly enough for me to hear. Why does it matter what job she has? We're her parents. That's what matters. But Preston understood perfectly. I saw him loosen his collar slightly. His hand trembled almost imperceptibly as he lifted a glass of water. He shuffled his papers like a man preparing for a battle he suddenly suspected he might lose. Because his strategy had depended on one thing: pressure. He had expected me to settle rather than endure a long and expensive fight. But that strategy had just collapsed, and the trial hadn't even truly begun yet. Now Preston would have to prove his case. And from the look on his face, he was realizing just how thin his evidence really was. Judge Anderson turned toward our table. Mr. Chen, your opening statement. Marcus stood. In that moment, I felt a deep surge of gratitude for him. He had prepared for this just as carefully as I had. He understood that the opening statement would shape everything that followed. His approach could not have been more different from Preston's theatrical performance. Marcus didn't appeal to emotion. He didn't raise his voice. He didn't pace or gesture dramatically. Instead, he spoke with precise calmness, every word deliberate. Your Honor, he began, the plaintiffs claim they searched for their daughter for 30 years. He paused. We will present evidence showing they didn't search for 30 minutes. A ripple moved through the courtroom. They claim they loved her. We will present documentation from teachers, medical professionals, and law enforcement showing long-term neglect and intentional abandonment. Another pause. They claim Mr. Arthur Bennett's adoption was fraudulent, that he somehow stole their daughter. Marcus turned slightly toward me. We will present evidence showing that Mr. Bennett's actions were the most legitimate and righteous act in this entire story, a man rescuing a child who had been discarded. He let the words settle. Then he continued, steady and clear. This case is not truly about inheritance law or adoption procedure. It is about two people who abandoned their 5-year-old daughter in a shopping mall, walked away without looking back, and spent 30 years building lies to avoid responsibility. He gestured toward the evidence boxes stacked beside our table. Now, after discovering that the child they threw away grew into a successful adult despite them, they seek to profit from the life she built without their help, without their love, and without anything from them except trauma. The room was completely silent. We have security footage, Marcus continued calmly. We have witness statements. We have medical records, school reports, police documentation, and bank records. He looked directly at the judge. The evidence will speak for itself, Your Honor. And it will speak loudly. Marcus sat down. No theatrics, no emotional theatrics, just the promise of overwhelming proof. The contrast with Preston's dramatic storytelling was stark. In the gallery, I caught Emily's eye. She nodded slightly, her expression a mixture of support and restrained anger toward the people who had lied to both of us. She was ready to tell the truth. Judge Anderson wrote something in her notebook, then looked up. Proceed with your first witness, Mr. Chen. Marcus stood again, and the next thing he did changed the entire atmosphere of the courtroom. Marcus walked to the front of the room where a large screen had been set up. He held a small remote in one hand and a thin folder in the other. Your Honor, he said, the defense would like to present video evidence obtained from the King of Prussia Mall security archives. This footage has been authenticated by the mall's security company and verified by independent forensic video analysts as original and unedited. Judge Anderson nodded. Proceed. The lights dimmed slightly. The screen flickered to life. Grainy security footage appeared. In the corner of the screen, a timestamp read, November 6th, 1993, 2:47 p.m. The camera angle showed the toy section of a department store, high enough to capture the entire aisle. I felt my breath catch in my throat. The small girl who appeared on the screen was me, 5 years old, wearing a faded purple coat with a broken zipper, holding a worn stuffed rabbit. My mother, Linda, led the little girl into the aisle, bent down and said something the microphone couldn't capture. The child nodded eagerly. Then Linda stood up and walked away, without looking back. The video switched angles. Now the parking lot outside the mall appeared. The courtroom watched in complete silence as Michael and Linda O'Hara walked calmly toward their car. There was no panic, no searching, no confusion. They moved with the casual pace of shoppers leaving a store after finishing their errands. A mall employee approached them. Even without audio, the body language was obvious. The employee was asking a question, gesturing back toward the building. Michael waved his hand dismissively. Both parents shook their heads. Then they got into their car, closed the doors, and drove away. Marcus paused the footage. The timestamp read, 2:51 p.m., 4 minutes. In the frozen frame, their car was halfway to the parking lot exit. Through the glass windows of the mall, a tiny figure could still be seen standing in the toy aisle. Marcus spoke quietly. 4 minutes. The courtroom remained silent. From the moment they left their daughter in the store, to the moment they drove off the property. 4 minutes. Not 4 hours of searching. Not even 4 minutes of hesitation. 4 minutes to abandon a 5-year-old child. I heard someone in the gallery whisper, "Oh my God." Someone else began quietly crying. I kept my eyes forward. I refused to look at Michael or Linda. But Marcus wasn't finished. "Your Honor," he said, "the defense also has audio enhancement of this footage." A forensic audio specialist isolated and amplified the conversation that occurred in the parking lot. He pressed the remote again. The video replayed, this time with sound. The mall employee's voice came through first. "Excuse me, ma'am. Did you have a little girl with you? There's a child in the toy section asking for her mother." Linda's voice responded immediately, cold, clear. "No, no one with us. We're alone." The employee tried again. "Are you sure? She matches your description." Michael cut him off, irritated. "We said we don't have a kid with us." The video showed them turning away, walking toward the car. Then Linda's voice came again, quieter, but still audible after the enhancement. "Finally. Let's go before she starts crying where someone can hear." The courtroom fell into stunned silence. The courtroom exploded. Gasps echoed through the room. People whispered in shock. Somewhere behind me, someone let out a strangled sob. Judge Anderson struck her gavel repeatedly. "Order! Order in the court!" It took several moments before the room quieted again. I kept my eyes fixed on the screen, staring at the frozen image of the car leaving the parking lot. I didn't trust myself to look anywhere else. If I turned toward my biological parents, I wasn't sure I could maintain the professional composure I had fought so hard to keep. At the plaintiff's table, Linda O'Hara sat completely still. Her face had gone pale, almost gray, and her hands gripped the edge of the table so tightly that her knuckles had turned white. Beside her, Michael O'Hara stared straight ahead. His jaw was clenched so tightly that a muscle jumped in his cheek. He refused to look at the screen, refusing to acknowledge the image of himself walking away from his 5-year-old daughter without even turning his head. Across the aisle, Lawrence Preston closed his eyes briefly. I saw him inhale slowly, the look on his face unmistakable. He knew. The case he had built, every argument, every emotional appeal, had just collapsed. No explanation could erase what the courtroom had just seen. No story could rewrite 4 minutes of video. Judge Anderson restored order and nodded toward Marcus. "Continue, Mr. Chen." Marcus stood. "The defense calls James Whitmore to the stand." An elderly man rose slowly from the gallery. The moment I saw him, I recognized him. James Whitmore. The mall security officer who had sat with me in the security office all those years ago. The man who had tried to comfort a frightened 5-year-old while the police figured out what to do with a child whose parents never came back. He was 70 now. His hair was completely white, and his shoulders were slightly bent with age, but his eyes were still sharp, kind in the same way I remembered. He walked to the witness stand, took the oath, and settled into the chair. Marcus approached him with quiet respect. "Mr. Whitmore, could you please tell the court what your position was on November 6, 1993? "I was the head of security at King of Prussia Mall," James said clearly. I had been in that role for 15 years by then. "And do you remember the incident involving the child in the toy section?" James nodded slowly. "I remember it like it was yesterday." His gaze moved to me for a moment, filled with both warmth and sadness. "I've thought about that little girl for 31 years. I often wondered what became of her." Marcus guided him carefully through the events of that day. James described finding a small girl standing in the toy aisle. He explained how she hadn't moved for over an hour. "She never wandered," he said. "She never screamed for help, she just stood there waiting." His voice softened slightly. "She believed someone was coming back for her." He paused before continuing. "I worked security for 30 years. I know the difference between a lost child and an abandoned one. A lost child panics. They cry. They run around looking for their parents. That little girl didn't do any of that. She waited." He turned slowly in his seat and looked directly at Michael and Linda O'Hara. His expression was no longer gentle. It was filled with quiet contempt. "I reviewed the footage with police that night," he said. "I watched you walk away without looking back. I watched you deny knowing her when one of my employees asked about the child." For a moment his voice trembled slightly. "I carried guilt for years, wondering if I should have done more, if I could have protected that little girl from whatever life awaited her." He glanced toward me again. "But seeing her here today, seeing the woman she became," he shook his head. "I realized she was saved." "Saved from you?" "Objection!" Preston jumped to his feet. "The witness is offering opinion rather than factual testimony." "Sustained," Judge Anderson said calmly. "Mr. Whitmore, please limit your statements to factual observations." "Yes, Your Honor." But the damage was already done. The truth now stood in the center of the courtroom, supported by video, audio, and the testimony of the man who had been there the day it happened. And Marcus wasn't finished. After James Whitmore stepped down, Marcus returned to our table. He picked up a laptop and a small external hard drive. My chest tightened. I knew exactly what was coming next. We had watched the recording together many times during preparation. Each time had been painful and deeply moving. But seeing it here, in this courtroom, in front of the people who had abandoned me, was something entirely different. Marcus walked back to the front of the room. "Your Honor," he said, "the defense would like to present a video recorded by Arthur Bennett approximately 6 months before his death. This recording was made in the presence of his attorney, Mr. Keller, who can verify both the authenticity of the recording and Mr. Bennett's full mental capacity at the time." Preston stood immediately. "Objection, Your Honor. This is hearsay. The declarant is deceased and cannot be cross-examined." Judge Anderson considered the objection. "Mr. Chen?" Marcus responded calmly. "Your Honor, the recording contains statements made by the declarant regarding his own actions, intentions, and state of mind. The video was created voluntarily while he possessed full legal capacity and in the presence of a witness. Under the state of mind exception to the hearsay rule, the statement is admissible." The courtroom held its breath, because whatever Arthur Bennett had recorded was about to be heard for the first time. "Mr. Hale is explaining his own actions and observations," Marcus continued calmly. "He is not repeating statements made by others. This recording speaks directly to his intentions and state of mind." Judge Anderson considered for only a moment. "Objection overruled," she said. "The video may be presented." The courtroom lights dimmed again. The screen flickered to life, but this time the image wasn't grainy security footage. It was Arthur Bennett sitting in his study. I recognized the room immediately. The tall bookshelves filled with worn paperbacks. The wooden desk where he had helped me with homework countless nights. The window behind him that looked out over the small garden he had spent years tending. But Arthur himself looked different. Smaller. Thinner. His face was hollowed by illness, his hair more gray than I remembered, yet his eyes were the same, clear, focused, and gentle. "My name is Arthur Bennett," he began. His voice was slightly weaker than I remembered, but steady. "I'm recording this on August 3rd, 2023. My attorney, Thomas Keller, is present as a witness." He paused briefly. "If you're watching this recording, it means I have passed away, and someone has challenged Catherine's inheritance." I expected that might happen. The courtroom was completely silent. Arthur leaned slightly forward. "Let me explain why." Tears already burned behind my eyes, but I forced myself to keep watching. "I adopted Catherine legally after she was abandoned at the age of 5 in King of Prussia Mall. The adoption process took nearly 2 years. It included background investigations, home studies, and court hearings. Every step was conducted legally, transparently, and with full approval from the state." He paused again, gathering strength. "But I always suspected that someday her biological parents might return. Not out of love, not out of remorse, but because an opportunity presented itself." Arthur reached beside him and lifted several documents into view. "So I took precautions Catherine never knew about. I hired a private investigator named Robert Chen. Over the next 30 years, he checked in periodically, not constantly, but often enough to document the lives and actions of Michael and Linda O'Hara. He held up several files so the camera could see them clearly. What he discovered confirmed every fear I had. They never searched for Catherine. They never filed a missing persons report beyond the initial police incident. They never contacted the National Center for Missing and Exploited Children. They never organized searches. They never made public appeals. Their search for their daughter existed only in stories they told their neighbors." Arthur's expression hardened slightly. "But it gets worse." In 1994, Michael O'Hara took out a life insurance policy on Catherine, listing her as a dependent despite having no custody and no contact with her. In 1995, he filed a claim on that policy. He declared her presumed dead. He collected $75,000. Arthur raised several bank statements toward the camera. These records show how that money was spent. A 10-day trip to Las Vegas. New furniture. Credit card debt from gambling and shopping. He lowered the documents slowly. Not $1 was spent searching for their daughter. They profited from her disappearance. The courtroom remained absolutely silent. Even the reporters had stopped writing. Arthur continued. "I never told Catherine about this monitoring. I wanted her to grow up free from the burden of knowing those people still existed in the background of her life. But I kept the evidence. For exactly this moment. For exactly this situation." His voice softened slightly. "I knew that if Catherine ever became successful, if she inherited anything from me, they might return. Not as parents, but as opportunists." Arthur placed the documents back on the desk. Then he looked directly into the camera. For a moment, it felt as if he were looking directly at me. These people did not lose a daughter. They discarded one. They walked away from her deliberately. And they did it without remorse. They have spent 30 years building lies to escape responsibility. And now they want to profit from the life she built without them. His voice grew firm. "Don't let them." Then his expression softened again. The change was so sudden it broke something inside me. "My daughter," he said gently. "If you are watching this, I want you to understand something. I did not choose you out of pity. I did not take you in because I felt sorry for you. I chose you because the moment I saw you standing in that toy aisle, holding that stuffed rabbit, counting patiently, even though you must have been terrified, I saw strength. I saw courage. I saw a child who deserved far more than she had been given. You were never unwanted, Catherine. You were always worthy. You were always enough." Tears streamed down my face. I didn't even try to hide them anymore. Arthur continued softly. I watched you grow from a frightened little girl into a woman of compassion and justice. I watched you turn your pain into purpose. And nothing in my life has ever made me prouder. Every day with you has been a gift I never expected, Arthur continued in the video. The money I left you means nothing compared to what you gave me. Purpose, joy, family. You gave me the privilege of being your father, and that is worth more than any fortune. He leaned slightly closer to the camera, his eyes intense despite the illness that had weakened him. Don't let those people make you doubt your worth for even a moment. Don't let them rewrite history or make you question whether you deserved love. You were always enough. You were always loved. You were always my daughter, and you always will be. The screen went black. For several long seconds, the courtroom remained silent. Then the quiet was broken by soft crying from different corners of the gallery. My hands trembled as I wiped tears from my face. Marcus quietly passed me a box of tissues. When I glanced behind me, I saw Emily openly crying. A few of the journalists were wiping their eyes as well. Even Judge Anderson's expression had softened, though she maintained her composure. At the plaintiff's table, Michael and Linda sat rigid and expressionless. Their lawyer looked defeated, staring down at his notes as though hoping they might somehow provide a way out. Judge Anderson cleared her throat. We will take a 15-minute recess. She struck the gavel once and stood. Everyone in the room rose as she left the bench. The evidence so far had been overwhelming. Video, audio, eyewitness testimony, and Arthur's recorded statement. It seemed impossible that anything could make the situation worse for the plaintiffs, but Marcus had one more witness to call. After the break, I splashed water on my face in the courthouse restroom and forced myself to breathe steadily. When we returned to the courtroom, the emotional atmosphere had shifted slightly. The weight of Arthur's words still lingered, but Marcus was ready to move the case from emotion to cold, measurable facts. The defense calls Dr. Helen Rodriguez, Marcus announced. A woman in her early 50s stepped forward carrying a tablet and a thick file folder. She wore a dark business suit and thin glasses that gave her a precise, professional appearance. She was sworn in and took her seat. Marcus approached the stand. Dr. Rodriguez, please state your credentials for the court. I am a forensic accountant with 22 years of experience, she replied calmly. I hold a doctorate in accounting from Stanford University and am certified in financial forensics. I have testified as an expert witness in over 100 cases involving financial fraud, embezzlement, and economic damages. And have you reviewed the financial records of Michael and Linda O'Hara? I have, she said. Extensively. Marcus nodded. Please explain your findings. Doctor. Rodriguez tapped her tablet, and a series of charts appeared on the courtroom screen. Her voice was neutral and clinical, which somehow made the information even more devastating. Over the past decade, Mr. and Mrs. Newman have accumulated approximately $63,000 in credit card debt across 7 separate accounts, all currently delinquent. They have also taken out multiple payday loans, some with interest rates exceeding 300% annually. Another chart appeared. They have refinanced their home 3 times since 2015 in order to extract equity to pay previous debts. The home is currently valued at approximately $140,000, while the outstanding mortgage balance exceeds $210,000, leaving them significantly underwater. She changed the slide again. They have had 2 vehicles repossessed within the past 5 years. Their credit scores are both below 500, which places them in the poor category. Additionally, there are currently 3 court judgments against them totaling more than $30,000 in unpaid debts. Dr. Rodriguez glanced up briefly before continuing. However, perhaps the most significant financial pattern involves Mr. Newman's gambling activity. Casino records appeared on the screen. Records from 3 casinos show cumulative losses of approximately $40,000 over the past 5 years. These are not occasional recreational visits, she added. They represent consistent, habitual gambling behavior coinciding with the family's financial decline. She brought up a timeline. The Newmans have been in a state of financial crisis since at least 2015. However, their situation became particularly severe in late 2023 and early 2024. She pointed to two highlighted dates. In December 2023, they received a foreclosure notice for their home. In January 2024, they were 3 months behind on mortgage payments. Then she displayed one final slide. On January 17, 2024, a local news broadcast reported that Judge Catherine O'Hara had inherited $2.7 million from Arthur Bennett. A second date appeared beside it. On January 28, 2024, exactly 11 days later, Michael and Linda O'Hara filed the lawsuit currently before this court. Dr. Rodriguez looked directly at Judge Anderson. In my professional opinion, based on 22 years analyzing financial behavior, the timing indicates opportunistic motivation rather than parental concern. If their primary intention had been to reconnect with their daughter, one would expect attempts to contact her prior to learning of her inheritance. She paused. The fact that legal action was initiated only 11 days after the news report, while the plaintiffs were facing foreclosure, strongly suggests that financial desperation was the primary motivation. She closed her tablet. They did not search for their daughter for 30 years. They searched for her 11 days after discovering she had money. The courtroom fell into heavy silence. Preston rose slowly for cross-examination, but for the first time since the trial began, he looked uncertain about where to begin. Preston stood for cross-examination, but his confidence was gone. He asked a few technical questions about Dr. Rodriguez's methodology, how she obtained the financial records, how the timelines were verified, whether the casino records were certified. Dr. Rodriguez answered each question calmly and precisely. Within minutes, Preston realized there was nothing he could dismantle. The timeline she had established was mathematically undeniable. He sat down, but Marcus wasn't finished. "Your Honor," Marcus said, standing again, "the defense would like to introduce email correspondence obtained during legal discovery." He connected the laptop to the screen. A series of emails appeared. The courtroom watched as my biological parents' greed unfolded in their own words. The first email appeared. From Linda O'Hara. Date, February 3, 2024. Marcus read it aloud. "Mr. Preston, I want to be clear about our priorities. We don't care about having a relationship with her. We need the money. Our house is in foreclosure and creditors are calling constantly. Tell her we'll go to the press if she doesn't settle. Make her understand that fighting this will damage her reputation as a judge. She'll settle to avoid the scandal. Get us as much as you can." A wave of murmurs moved through the gallery. Marcus clicked to the next email. From Michael O'Hara. Date, February 3, 2024. "How much can we squeeze out of her? The $2.7 million sounds good, but is that really all she got? Can we sue for more? What about emotional damages for all these years? Mental anguish. We should be asking for at least $5 million. She's a judge. She can afford it." The courtroom went completely still. These weren't grieving parents trying to reconnect with a lost child. These were people calculating how much money they could extract. Preston's face flushed red. He stood abruptly. "Your Honor, these emails are privileged communications between an attorney and his clients." "Yes," Marcus replied smoothly, "but these specific emails were copied to a third party, the plaintiff's financial advisor. That action waived attorney-client privilege." He held up the discovery documentation. They were obtained legally through standard discovery procedures, and opposing counsel was notified. Judge Anderson reviewed the documents briefly. "The emails are admissible. Proceed." Preston didn't even attempt cross-examination. There was nothing he could say that would erase his client's own words. Marcus then called several character witnesses, former neighbors from the early 1990s. The first two described a chaotic household filled with shouting, instability, and neglect. But the third witness changed the atmosphere completely. Her name was Grace Chen. She was 78 years old, a tiny woman with white hair and thick glasses that magnified her kind eyes. She walked slowly to the stand and carefully settled into the chair. Marcus approached her gently. Mrs. Chen, did you know the Newman family in the early 1990s? I lived next door from 1988 to 1995, she said softly. So yes, I knew them. And did you know their daughter? Her eyes filled with tears. That poor little girl, she whispered. I called child services twice. The courtroom leaned forward. I used to see her outside in winter without a proper coat. Sometimes she'd be alone in the yard for hours. Her parents were inside fighting. You could hear yelling and things breaking. She wiped her eyes with a trembling hand. I invited her over a few times. I gave her cookies, hot chocolate. She was always so grateful. Her voice broke slightly. Like no one ever showed her kindness at home. She paused before continuing. When Linda told everyone the child had been kidnapped at the mall, I wanted to believe her. I really did. But something never felt right. The courtroom was completely silent. I saw Linda's face when she told the story. Grace turned slowly toward the plaintiff's table. She didn't look devastated. She looked relieved. Linda stared at the table. She looked like someone who had solved a problem, Grace continued quietly. Not like someone who had lost a child. Grace shook her head slowly. That look haunted me for years. I told myself grief affects people differently. But now, seeing all this, she looked toward me. I'm just grateful that little girl survived. And that she found someone who truly loved her. Grace stepped down from the stand. The courtroom remained silent for several seconds. The evidence had now become overwhelming. Security footage, audio recordings, witness testimony, financial records, email evidence, and Arthur's final message. Everything pointed to one unavoidable truth. Michael and Linda O'Hara had deliberately abandoned their daughter and were now trying to profit from her success. But the moment that followed stunned the entire courtroom. Marcus stood once more. The defense calls Emily Newman to the stand. The reaction was immediate. Gasps echoed through the room. Preston shot to his feet. Objection, Your Honor. This witness was never disclosed during discovery. Marcus remained calm. Ms. Newman only contacted us 3 days ago. As soon as she agreed to testify, we filed an emergency disclosure with the court and opposing counsel. Judge Anderson turned toward Preston. Did you receive that notice? Preston shuffled through his papers. Yes, but 3 days is insufficient time to prepare. The rules allow late disclosure under exceptional circumstances, Judge Anderson interrupted. The witness may testify. You will have full opportunity for cross-examination. Emily stood from the gallery. Every head in the courtroom turned toward her as she walked toward the witness stand. Her shoulders were straight, but I could see her hands trembling slightly. As she passed the plaintiff's table, Michael leaned toward her and hissed angrily, "What the hell are you doing?" Linda looked like she might collapse. Her face had drained of all color. Preston leaned toward them, whispering urgently, trying to understand what was happening. But Emily didn't even look at them. She kept walking, straight toward the witness stand, straight toward the truth. For a moment she looked directly at Michael and Linda O'Hara. Her expression held sadness, but also unshakable resolve. Then she turned toward Marcus. Marcus approached the stand gently. Ms. O'Hara, he began, can you explain your relationship to the plaintiffs? Emily's voice was steady. Michael and Linda O'Hara are my biological parents. And Catherine O'Hara is my sister, technically my half-sister, but I consider her fully my sister. She's the one my parents told me had been kidnapped from a mall when I was a baby. And how long have you believed that story? Marcus asked. My entire life, Emily replied. 28 years. They told me about Catherine before I was old enough to really understand what it meant. The story was always part of our family history. The missing sister. The tragedy that defined us. Marcus nodded. Can you describe how that supposed tragedy affected your childhood? Emily took a slow breath before answering. They used Catherine's disappearance to explain everything, she said. Why we never had much money, because they'd spent so much searching for her. Why they seemed emotionally distant because they were grieving. Why they sometimes couldn't fully connect with me because part of them was still with the daughter they had lost. Her voice trembled slightly but didn't break. My mother once told me she couldn't love me the way she wanted to because her heart was broken over Catherine. She said it like it was something I should understand. I spent 28 years feeling guilty for being the daughter who remained. Emily looked down briefly. I wondered all the time if they wished I had been the one who disappeared instead. A quiet murmur moved through the courtroom. I shaped my entire life around their grief, she continued, trying to be good enough, successful enough, present enough, to somehow make up for the sister they'd lost. Tears blurred my vision as I listened. Our parents had destroyed both of our childhoods, mine through abandonment, hers through lies. Marcus waited until the room settled again. When did you first begin questioning this narrative? In late July of this year, Emily said. I overheard them talking about a lawsuit. They mentioned getting money from her and making sure I never connected them to the old story. At first I didn't understand, but I started asking questions, and their answers kept changing. They became defensive when I asked for details about the search they supposedly conducted. What did you do next? Marcus asked. I hired a private investigator, Emily replied. I needed the truth. And what did the investigator discover? Emily took a moment before answering. He discovered that they never searched for Catherine. He found the insurance policy my father took out after abandoning her. He found records showing they cashed the policy by declaring her presumed dead. He found bank statements showing they spent the money on a vacation and new furniture. He found neighbors who remembered neglect. And he proved that everything they told me was a lie. The courtroom sat in stunned silence. Marcus walked to the evidence table and picked up a document. Ms. O'Hara, I'm showing you an email written by your mother to Mr. Preston. Have you seen this before? Emily glanced at the page. Yes. And what does it say? Her jaw tightened. It says they don't care about having a relationship with Catherine. It says they just want the money. Marcus nodded once. Based on everything you've learned, do you believe your parents intentionally abandoned your sister? Emily slowly turned to face Michael and Linda. Tears streamed down her face, but her voice remained steady. Yes. They threw her away. They treated her like she was a burden they wanted to get rid of. And then they built their entire lives on the lie that she had been kidnapped. They used that lie to excuse every failure, every bad decision, every moment they couldn't be the parents they should have been. They didn't search for her. They erased her. They pretended she had been taken when they were the ones who walked away. Her gaze shifted to Judge Anderson. I'm testifying today because my sister deserves someone in this family to choose her. She was 5 years old and alone when they abandoned her. No one protected her then. Emily wiped her tears but kept speaking. Today I'm protecting her. Today I'm choosing her over the people who lied to both of us. Across the room, Linda collapsed into sobs. But they weren't the sobs of regret. They were the sobs of humiliation. Her carefully constructed story had just been destroyed in front of an entire courtroom. Beside her, Michael sat rigid with anger, gripping the table so hard his knuckles turned white. Their own daughter, the child they had kept, had just exposed them. Preston attempted cross-examination, but his questions were weak and scattered. He suggested Emily had been manipulated by me. Emily calmly explained that she had hired her own investigator before ever contacting me. He suggested she might be exaggerating their financial motives. Emily pointed directly to the emails and the evidence already entered into record. Within minutes, Preston stopped. He returned to his seat. There was nothing left for him to fight with, and everyone in that courtroom could feel it. The case was already over. The courtroom fell silent as Emily O'Hara stepped down from the witness stand, but she didn't return to the gallery. Instead, she walked straight toward the defense table, toward me. She pulled out the empty chair beside mine and sat down. Marcus didn't object. Judge Anderson didn't stop her. Emily was making a statement about where she stood now, about which side of the story she belonged to, and everyone in the room understood. Judge Anderson called for closing arguments. At this point, they felt almost unnecessary. The evidence had spoken with overwhelming clarity. No amount of rhetoric could erase the security footage, the financial records, the emails, the witnesses, or Arthur Bennett's final message. Preston delivered his closing first. It was short, flat, a routine performance from a lawyer who already knew the case was lost. Marcus followed. He didn't raise his voice or dramatize anything. He simply summarized the facts. "The evidence shows deliberate abandonment," he said. "It shows 30 years of lies. And it shows a lawsuit motivated entirely by financial desperation." Then he sat down. "The court will take a brief recess to consider the evidence," Judge Anderson announced. She left the bench. I expected hours of deliberation. Complex civil cases often require judges to review documents, compare testimony, and weigh legal precedent. But Judge Anderson returned in 40 minutes. That alone told everyone in the courtroom exactly how this was going to end. When she entered, the room was even more crowded than before. Word had spread through the courthouse about the extraordinary testimony. Emily sat beside me, her shoulder almost touching mine. My sister. The family I had never known existed. Judge Anderson glanced briefly at her notes before lifting her gaze to the plaintiffs. When she spoke, her voice carried unmistakable authority. "This court finds in favor of the defendant, Catherine O'Hara, on all counts." A ripple moved through the courtroom. The plaintiff's claim of wrongful adoption is denied in its entirety. Their claim to inheritance rights is denied in its entirety. She paused before continuing. "Furthermore, this court finds that this lawsuit was filed in bad faith, with malicious intent, and without credible legal basis." Her eyes settled firmly on Michael and Linda O'Hara. "The evidence presented during this trial does not describe a family tragedy. It describes a family crime." The courtroom remained completely still. "You did not lose your daughter," Judge Anderson continued. "You abandoned her. You deliberately left a 5-year-old child alone and walked away. You never attempted to find her. You never attempted to take responsibility. And you now seek to profit from the life she built without you." Her voice hardened slightly. "Arthur Bennett's adoption of Catherine O'Hara was not only legal, it was compassionate. He gave her the family you refused to be." Michael stared forward, jaw tight. Linda sat motionless, her face drained of emotion. "This lawsuit is dismissed with prejudice," Judge Anderson said. "That means you may never bring this claim again in any court. The evidence is conclusive. You have no legal or moral claim to any part of Catherine O'Hara's inheritance, or her life." Under the table, Emily's hand found mine and squeezed tightly. For the first time since the lawsuit began, I felt something close to peace. Not triumph, not revenge, vindication. The court had officially declared what I had always known. Arthur had been right. The life we built together had been real, legitimate, and untouched by the people who abandoned me. But Marcus wasn't finished. He stood again. "Your Honor," he said, "the defense would like to file a counterclaim." Preston's head snapped up. Judge Anderson raised an eyebrow. "Proceed, Mr. Chen." Marcus presented documents I had signed several days earlier. "We were suing Michael and Linda O'Hara for defamation, intentional infliction of emotional distress, malicious prosecution. The damages requested totaled $500,000. Preston scrambled to his feet. "Your Honor, this is highly irregular. We were not given adequate notice." Judge Anderson cut him off. "The counterclaim is properly filed and legally valid. Given that the facts of this case have already been established in this proceeding, I am willing to hear arguments immediately." She looked toward Marcus. "Mr. Chen, are you prepared?" "I am, Your Honor." She turned to Preston. "Mr. Preston?" Preston looked at his clients. They had nothing to offer him. No preparation, no evidence, no defense. "Yes, Your Honor," he said weakly. Marcus presented the counterclaim with the same calm precision he had used throughout the trial. He explained how the lawsuit had damaged my reputation as a magistrate judge. He showed news articles questioning the legitimacy of my inheritance. He demonstrated how I had been forced to publicly relive the most traumatic moment of my life in order to defend myself. He detailed the sleepless nights, the therapy sessions, the emotional harm caused by being dragged back into contact with the people who had abandoned me. This lawsuit, Marcus concluded, was not simply misguided. It was malicious. He then presented the emails again. The plaintiffs explicitly stated their intent to threaten Judge O'Hara's reputation in order to pressure a financial settlement. That is extortion. Preston offered a weak defense. He argued that his clients believed their claim was valid, that they had simply followed legal advice. But the courtroom already knew the truth, and so did the judge. The case that had begun with lies was about to end with consequences. But Judge Anderson showed no sympathy. After barely 15 minutes of argument, she delivered her ruling on the counterclaim. I find in favor of the defendant. Michael and Linda O'Hara are jointly and severally liable for damages in the amount of $350,000, plus court costs totaling $42,000. She looked at them with cold finality. You came into this courtroom seeking money you never earned, claiming rights you forfeited 30 years ago. Instead, you will pay for the damage you caused. Perhaps now you will understand that actions have consequences. The number was devastating. For people already drowning in debt, it wasn't just punishment. It was financial annihilation. I watched the reality slowly settle across their faces. They didn't have $350,000. They didn't even have $35,000. That judgment would follow them for the rest of their lives, placing liens on anything they might ever own, garnishing future wages, destroying any hope of financial recovery. They were ruined. Completely. Permanently. Preston gathered his papers with trembling hands, refusing to look at his clients. I suspected he had just learned an expensive lesson about accepting cases based on potential payout instead of actual merit. Michael and Linda rose slowly. They moved like people in shock. But the courtroom wasn't finished with them yet. As they pushed through the gate separating the courtroom floor from the gallery, reporters surged forward. Cameras flashed. Microphones appeared from every direction. Mr. Newman, do you have a response to the ruling? Mrs. Newman, do you regret abandoning your daughter? How do you respond to your other daughter testifying against you? They covered their faces, trying to push through the crowd, but there was no hiding. Their humiliation was now public record, captured in court transcripts, news footage, and headlines that would never disappear. Emily didn't follow them. She stayed seated beside me. Her decision had already been made. She had chosen her family. And it wasn't the people who raised her with lies. It was the sister she had. The woman who survived what they had done. I watched my biological parents disappear through the courtroom doors, reporters trailing them down the hallway, and I felt something unexpected, not triumph, not revenge, just closure. A chapter of my life had finally ended. Marcus placed a hand on my shoulder. It's over, he said quietly. But he was wrong. The courtroom battle was over. The legal vindication was complete, but the consequences of their betrayal were only beginning. The verdict had been delivered in a courtroom of maybe 50 people, but within hours, the story had spread far beyond those walls. By that evening, news outlets across the country were running headlines. Emily and I sat in my living room watching them appear on my phone. Parents sue daughter, they abandoned, lose everything in court. Judge confronts birth parents who left her at age 5. Sister testifies against parents in explosive inheritance case. The story had everything the media loved: abandonment, redemption, courtroom drama, justice. The security footage of 5-year-old me standing alone in the toy section became the image every network used. That small girl in the purple coat, clutching a stuffed rabbit, waiting for parents who never came back. It became impossible to ignore. Within 48 hours, Michael and Linda O'Hara were nationally infamous. Their photos spread across social media with captions calling them the most shameless parents in America. I watched the public reaction unfold with mixed emotions. Part of me felt vindicated. Another part felt uneasy. Their downfall had become entertainment for millions of strangers who knew nothing about our lives. Their address was doxed online. Hate mail flooded their mailbox until the postal carrier complained. Reporters camped outside their house, filming them closing curtains and refusing to come out. I didn't feel sympathy, but I didn't feel satisfaction either. Linda lost her part-time job at a grocery store. The store manager issued a carefully worded statement about media attention affecting operations, which really meant customers refused to shop while she worked there. Michael was banned from the casino he frequented, not because of publicity, because the casino didn't want their name connected to his. Even their church quietly asked them not to return. The pastor described it as a period of reflection. Everyone understood what it really meant. Exile. Former friends stopped answering their calls. Neighbors avoided them. The community that had once offered sympathy for their supposed tragedy now saw the truth. They had abandoned a 5-year-old child, then tried to profit from her success 3 decades later. There was no coming back from that. No way to rebuild a normal life. But Emily's life was moving in a completely different direction. The media coverage quickly painted Emily O'Hara as the courageous sister who chose truth over loyalty and justice over comfort. Parents at her school approached her with admiration and quiet support. Instead of reprimanding her for missing work, her principal called her into the office simply to tell her that her classroom would be covered for as long as she needed. Her well-being mattered more than attendance policies. For a while, Emily moved out of her apartment and stayed with me while she searched for a new place. Having her in my home felt both strange and completely natural. This sister I had only known for a few weeks somehow already felt like family in ways that transcended time. We fell into easy routines, cooking dinner together, talking late into the evening, discovering all the ways we were alike and all the ways we were different. We shared small habits neither of us had ever noticed before. The way we both tucked our hair behind our left ear when nervous. The skeptical expression we made when something sounded suspicious. Even our laughter, starting quietly before growing louder, was identical. We liked the same books, shared the same dry sense of humor, processed emotions the same way, talking through everything until it made sense. Emily told me stories from her childhood that filled in pieces of a life I had never seen. I told her about Arthur, about the man who had saved me and the life he had given me, and about the grief of losing him. What we were building together was something neither of us had ever experienced before. A sisterhood based on truth, on choice, on genuine love rather than obligation or shared trauma. One night, about 2 weeks after the trial, Emily said something that made me cry. We were sitting on the couch drinking tea, talking about nothing particularly important, when she suddenly became quiet. "I spent 28 years being their daughter," she said softly. "I'd like to spend the rest of my life being your sister." For a moment I couldn't speak. I pulled her into a hug. When I finally found my voice, I whispered, "You already are. You became my sister the moment you chose to stand beside me." 2 weeks after the verdict, my phone rang with a number I didn't recognize. I let it go to voicemail. Later that evening I listened to the message. It was Linda O'Hara. Her voice sounded smaller than I had ever heard it. "Catherine, we need to talk. We made mistakes and we're sorry." She hesitated. "We just want to apologize. Maybe we could—" Her voice faltered, as if she couldn't find the words to undo 30 years of abandonment and a lawsuit built on greed. "Please call back." I listened once, then I deleted the message. Emily looked up from the book she was reading. "Are you going to respond?" she asked. I shook my head while opening my phone settings. "I'm blocking the number." "She isn't sorry for what she did," I said quietly. "She's sorry she got caught and lost." "That's not the same thing." Emily nodded immediately. "You don't owe her forgiveness." "I don't owe her anything," I replied. "Some apologies come too late. Some cost too little. And some mean nothing when they're forced by consequences instead of conscience." That voicemail wasn't about remorse. It was about easing their guilt, about checking a box so they could tell themselves they had tried. But I had no responsibility to grant them absolution. They abandoned me once. I wasn't going to let them manipulate me into giving them peace now. I set my phone aside and returned my attention to Emily, to the present, to the life I was building that had nothing to do with the people who tried to destroy it. They no longer had power over me. They could no longer define my worth, and they certainly could not determine my future. I had won, not just in court, but in the deeper battle of refusing to let their cruelty define who I became. When the media storm finally began to calm, I requested a temporary leave from my duties as a magistrate judge. The court granted it immediately. They understood that what I had endured in that courtroom was more than a legal battle. It was the reopening of a lifetime of buried trauma. For the first time in years, I stepped away from the bench, away from the steady rhythm of hearings and rulings that had structured my life. During that month, I kept returning to Arthur Bennett's will and the video he had recorded. I must have watched that recording a dozen times, studying his face, listening to his voice, trying to understand every word he had left behind for me. One phrase echoed in my mind again and again. May she use it to build the life she deserves. At first, I had thought about the inheritance in practical terms: financial security, investments, maybe a larger home. But Arthur hadn't left me that money simply so I could live comfortably. He had left it so I could build something meaningful, something worthy of the child I had been, and worthy of the man who had saved me. One evening, as Emily graded papers at the dining table and I reviewed documents for a children's advocacy nonprofit I had supported for years, the answer finally became clear. I'm going to start a foundation, I said suddenly. Emily looked up. What kind of foundation? For children who've been abandoned, I said. For kids stuck in foster care. For children who are still waiting for someone to choose them the way Arthur chose me. I paused before adding quietly, I'm going to call it the Arthur Bennett Foundation. Emily smiled. Her eyes filled with tears. He would love that, she said. Over the next 2 weeks, I poured myself into building the foundation with the same focus I had once given my legal career. I committed $1 million of my inheritance as the initial funding. I hired a nonprofit attorney to handle the legal structure, and I began drafting the mission statement. When it was finally finished, it read, Every child deserves to be chosen, protected, and loved. We exist for the children still waiting for their Arthur Bennett. Those words felt right. They honored the man who had saved my life, and they acknowledged the countless children still waiting for someone to see them, to choose them, to give them the safety and love they deserve. As news of the foundation spread, something unexpected happened. People began reaching out. Strangers, organizations, even families who had followed the trial, they all wanted to help. The first message came from Marcus Chen, the attorney who had stood beside me throughout the entire trial. His email was simple. Catherine, he wrote, I've been rethinking the direction of my legal career. Estate litigation has been successful, but it hasn't always felt meaningful. Would the Arthur Bennett Foundation benefit from having a legal advisor? I'd like to volunteer my services pro bono, handling compliance, contracts, and any legal matters that arise. This case reminded me why I became a lawyer in the first place, to help people who actually need it. I'd be honored to be part of this. I accepted immediately. Marcus's expertise would be invaluable, and his willingness to work without compensation meant that more of the foundation's resources could go directly toward helping children. And Marcus wasn't the only one. Dr. Helen Rodriguez, the forensic accountant who had testified about my biological parents' finances, emailed next. She offered to oversee the foundation's financial structure and auditing, also free of charge. Former colleagues from my days as a prosecutor volunteered to serve on the board of directors. Local businesses began offering donations. A web design company offered to build our website. A marketing firm proposed handling our publicity pro bono. The trial that had been intended to destroy me had instead done the opposite. It rallied an entire community around the mission. People who followed the story, people moved by the narrative of abandonment and resilience, wanted to help turn that pain into something meaningful. Media coverage of the foundation was overwhelmingly positive. Editorials praised what one columnist called turning abandonment into advocacy. Several articles pointed out the irony. My biological parents had tried to profit from my inheritance, but their lawsuit had inspired me to use that money to help children facing situations similar to mine. Donations began arriving, mostly small contributions, $20, $50, from strangers who had seen the story on the news. But together they grew quickly. By the end of the first month, the Arthur Bennett Foundation had raised more than $500,000 beyond my initial $1 million investment. Emily had been helping since the beginning, offering ideas, reading drafts of the Foundation's mission, helping shape the direction of our programs. About 3 weeks into the process, she approached me with a serious expression. "I'm a teacher," she said. "I understand child development, trauma-informed education, how to reach kids who've experienced instability." She paused. "I want to help build programs for the children your foundation will serve. Would that be useful?" I felt my throat tighten. "Emily," I said softly, "that would be incredible. I was hoping you'd want to be involved, but I didn't want to pressure you." "You're not pressuring me," she replied firmly. "This matters to me too. Not just because you're my sister. Because now I understand how many children grow up with lies and trauma shaping their lives. If I can help even a few of them process those experiences in healthier ways than I did, I want to do that." So I created a position for her. Education Director of the Arthur Bennett Foundation. Together we began developing programs specifically for abandoned children and kids in the foster system. Age-appropriate materials, workshops, resources that explain something many children desperately need to hear: that being abandoned doesn't mean they are unlovable, that being removed from a home doesn't mean they are broken, that none of it is their fault. Working together deepened our relationship in ways neither of us had expected. Our dining room turned into the Foundation's unofficial headquarters. Papers covered every surface: research studies, curriculum drafts, notes from social workers and foster care advocates. We discovered that we worked well together. Emily's creative and empathetic perspective balanced my more analytical, legal mindset. One night, after we finished writing a particularly difficult section about parental abandonment, Emily looked up from the papers. "I can't undo what they did to you," she said quietly. "I can't give you back those years. I can't erase the pain. But maybe I can help make sure fewer kids feel what you felt. Maybe we can build something that would have helped you when you were 5. I reached across the table and took her hand. "You already helped me," I told her. "You stood up in that courtroom and chose truth over comfort. You chose me over the people who raised you." "That meant everything." Emily squeezed my hand. "You're my sister," she said. "That's not negotiable anymore. It's not about biology. It's about choice. And I choose you." We were building more than a foundation. We were building the family both of us deserved. The kind of family that might have existed if our biological parents had been capable of love and honesty. Out of their cruelty and deception, something genuine had begun to grow. Something good. But there was still one person from the past who hadn't reappeared. 3 months after the Arthur Bennett Foundation officially opened, an unexpected visitor arrived at our office. We had rented a modest space downtown. Just Emily, me, and a part-time administrator trying to establish partnerships with foster care agencies and community organizations. I was reviewing grant applications when our administrator knocked on my office door. "There's a woman here to see you," she said. "She says it's personal." "What's her name?" "Margaret Holloway." The name didn't mean anything to me. I stepped into the reception area. A woman in her early 70s stood there. Her silver hair was pulled back neatly, and she wore wire-rimmed glasses. Her posture carried a quiet kind of determination, but something about her face felt familiar, like a photograph I had seen long ago but couldn't quite place. "Ms. Newman," she said gently, extending her hand. "Thank you for seeing me." "My name is Margaret Holloway," she hesitated. "I was Arthur's partner." "Arthur's?" "We were together for 5 years," she continued quietly. "From when you were about 12 until you were 17. I stood there for a moment, trying to reconcile her words with my memories. There were faint recollections of a woman who visited sometimes when I was a teenager. Arthur had introduced her simply as a friend. She had always been kind to me, warm, but never intrusive. But a partner? Someone he had loved? I'm sorry, I said finally, regaining my composure. Please, come into my office. We sat down across from each other. Margaret glanced around the room, the folders stacked on my desk, the framed mission statement of the foundation hanging on the wall. He would have loved this, she said softly. This is exactly the kind of thing he always hoped you would do. You were his partner? I asked gently. Margaret gave a small, sad smile. He wanted to marry me, she admitted. We talked about it seriously, but I got scared. She folded her hands together in her lap. I watched how hard he worked to raise you, how much emotional energy it took, how he put your needs ahead of everything else. I thought caring for you was a burden he had taken on out of obligation. She shook her head slowly. I didn't want my life to revolve around a child who wasn't mine. So, I left. Her eyes filled with tears. That was 20 years ago, she said quietly, and I've regretted it every single day. Not just because I lost Arthur, but because I was so wrong. You weren't his burden. You were his joy. You were the best thing that ever happened to him. And I was too selfish to see it. A complicated mix of emotions stirred inside me. Sadness that Arthur had lost someone he cared about. But also a protective anger rising instinctively. I had never asked to be abandoned. I had never asked Arthur to save me. I had just been a child who needed someone. Margaret seemed to read the expression on my face. This isn't about making you feel guilty, she said gently. You did nothing wrong. I did. I made a decision based on fear and selfishness, and I lost something precious because of it. She hesitated before continuing. I didn't come to Arthur's funeral. I felt like I had forfeited that right. But I've been following your story, the trial, the foundation. And there's something important about Arthur I think you should know. What is it? I asked. Margaret leaned forward slightly. He almost didn't adopt you. For a moment, I didn't respond. The process was complicated, she explained. His lawyer warned him it could take years, home studies, background checks, endless bureaucracy. His friends told him he was crazy. He was already in his mid-50s, comfortable life, successful career. They couldn't understand why he would disrupt everything for a traumatized child. She looked at me carefully. I watched him struggle with that decision for weeks. He would come to my apartment late at night and talk about it. He worried whether he could really be a father. He wondered if you might be better off with a younger couple who had parenting experience. He never told me he had doubts, I said quietly. Because by the time the adoption was finalized, she replied softly, he didn't have any. But in those early weeks, he did. And then one night he said something I'll never forget. Margaret's voice trembled slightly. He said, if I don't do this, I'll spend the rest of my life wondering what happened to that little girl. I can't live with that. She needs someone. And I'm someone. That's enough. Tears slid down Margaret's face. He chose the hard path because it was the right one. And when I left, because I couldn't handle that commitment, he never once considered giving you back. She paused. One of his friends suggested it, said maybe it was a sign that he should reconsider. That maybe you would be better with a traditional family. Margaret shook her head firmly. Arthur shut that down immediately. You were his choice, and he never regretted it. Not even when it cost him the chance at another relationship. She reached into her bag and pulled out a small wooden box. It looked old, dark wood worn smooth with time, secured with a simple brass clasp. Before he got sick, she said, before the cancer became obvious, Arthur called me. We hadn't spoken in years, but he asked me to meet him. He gave me this box. He said that if anything happened to him, I should give it to you. My hands trembled slightly as I took it. He said there were things you needed to know, Margaret continued, things he had written down but couldn't say out loud. I should have given it to you at the funeral. But I was too much of a coward. I'm sorry it took me so long. I opened the box carefully. Inside was a worn leather journal. The pages had yellowed slightly with age. I opened to the first page. Arthur's handwriting greeted me, neat, steady, familiar. The entry was dated just a few days after he brought me home from the mall. Day 3 with Catherine. She barely speaks, hardly eats. I found her crying in the bathroom at midnight, trying to be quiet so she wouldn't bother me. What if I fail her the way her parents did? What if I'm not enough? But I made her hot chocolate and we sat together until she fell asleep on the couch. Small victories. My throat tightened. I turned the page. Entry after entry documented that first year, his fears, his doubts, his quiet triumphs. One entry read, "She laughed today, a real laugh. I tried flipping a pancake and it stuck to the ceiling. If I can make her laugh, maybe I can help her heal." Another page. "Every child deserves to feel chosen. I choose her every single day, not because I have to, because I want to. She's extraordinary. I hope someday she believes that about herself." By the time I reached the final entry, my vision blurred with tears. The date was 6 months after he brought me home. Today, Catherine called me Dad. Not because I asked her to, because she wanted to. We were reading a bedtime story and she said it naturally. "Good night, Dad." I kept my voice steady, finished the story. But after I left her room, I sat in the hallway and cried. I've built companies, made money, earned respect, but nothing will ever mean more than earning that title from this remarkable child. I am the luckiest man alive. I closed the journal and held it against my chest. For the first time, I fully understood something I had only felt before. Arthur hadn't just saved me. He had loved being my father. Margaret stood quietly. "He loved you more than anything," she said softly. "More than his work. More than his money. More than me." She gave a gentle smile. "And that wasn't a burden. That was the greatest gift of his life." "You gave his life meaning," Margaret said softly as she stood to leave. "You gave him purpose. I hope knowing that brings you some comfort." After she left, I sat alone in my office with the journal pressed against my chest, crying tears that were both sorrowful and strangely joyful. Arthur had given me everything. And even years after his death, he was still giving me gifts, still reminding me how deeply I had been loved. But there was one more place I needed to visit. After reading Arthur's journal, I kept thinking about beginnings and endings, about how the worst day of my life had led me to the best person I had ever known. The date approaching on the calendar didn't escape me. November 6th, 31 years since I had been abandoned at King of Prussia Mall. That morning I woke with a clear sense of purpose. I needed to go back, not to relive the trauma, not to dwell on pain, but to close the circle, to stand in that place as the woman I had become, instead of the frightened child I had once been. Emily offered to come with me, but I told her I needed to do this alone. She understood. She hugged me tightly before I left and made me promise to call her afterward. The drive to the mall took about 40 minutes. With each mile, my heartbeat grew faster. I had never returned since that day. There had never been a reason to, and every reason to avoid it. But today was different. Today I was choosing to face my past. The mall had changed over the years. New stores filled spaces I vaguely remembered. The entrance had been renovated. The parking lot had been redesigned. Modern security cameras watched from every corner, far more advanced than the grainy systems that captured my abandonment in 1993. Still, the structure of the place felt strangely familiar. I walked through the entrance and followed instinct more than memory, letting my feet guide me toward the department store where the toy section had once been. The store had a new name now, different merchandise. But when I reached the back corner, I recognized it instantly. The toy section was still there. The brands had changed. Electronic games had replaced many of the toys I remembered, but the layout was almost the same corner, the same open space. I stepped forward slowly and stopped. I was almost certain I was standing in the exact place where 5-year-old me had stood, clutching Mr. Hoppy, counting to 60 again and again, waiting for a mother who was never coming back. Memories rushed over me with startling clarity. The confusion, The growing fear as 1 minute became 10, then 20. The moment I saw my parents walking away through the glass windows. The brief flicker of hope when my mother glanced back. And the crushing realization that she was leaving on purpose. But standing there now, 31 years later, I felt something different. Compassion, not shame. That little girl had done nothing wrong. She had been obedient, patient, trusting. Everything a child is supposed to be. The failure had never been hers. She had always deserved love and protection. And the fact that her biological parents couldn't give her those things said everything about them, and nothing about her. I had understood that intellectually for years, but standing in that spot, feeling the memories while knowing everything my life had become, something finally shifted deep inside me. The 5-year-old girl and the 36-year-old woman were the same person, and both deserved love. "Excuse me, miss. Are you all right?" I turned to see an elderly security guard approaching. Concern was written across his face. He wore the same type of uniform James Whitmore had worn decades ago, though now it carried the mall's modern logo. Then I looked more closely at him. "Mr. Whitmore?" I said in disbelief. He squinted at me, trying to place my face. Then recognition lit his eyes. "Judge Newman." He glanced around the toy section, and understanding dawned on his face. "Oh, you're here because today—" 31 years, I said quietly. I needed to come back. He gestured toward a nearby bench and we sat down together. He looked older than when I had seen him at the trial, but his eyes were still kind. "I think about you every year on November 6th, he admitted. "For decades I wondered what happened to you. I used to lie awake worrying, wondering if you ended up somewhere terrible, if I should have done more. When I saw you on the news during the trial," his voice broke slightly, "I cried. You took the worst thing that could happen to a child and turned it into something that protects other children. You're extraordinary." I shook my head. "I'm just someone who got lucky," I said. "Arthur Bennett saved me. Without him, I don't know what would have happened." "But you still had to survive," James replied firmly. "You still had to choose not to let that trauma destroy you. You built something meaningful out of pain. That was you." We sat quietly for a moment. Two people connected by one terrible day, 31 years earlier. Both of us reflecting on how that moment had shaped our lives. Before leaving the mall, I walked back to the toy section. This time I bought a stuffed rabbit. It wasn't identical to Mr. Hoppy. Toy designs had changed too much over the decades, but it was similar, soft, long floppy ears, gentle button eyes. The cashier smiled while ringing it up, probably assuming it was for a child. In a way, it was. That rabbit would go to the Arthur Bennett Foundation. It would be given to a child entering foster care. A small comfort from someone who understood exactly what it feels like to be scared and alone, holding on to something soft while the world falls apart. As I walked out of King of Prussia Mall, something inside me shifted. That place had once represented the lowest point of my life. The moment I learned I was disposable to the people who should have loved me most. But now it meant something else. It meant survival, transformation. It marked the beginning of the path that led me to Arthur, to my career, to Emily, to the foundation. I wasn't defined by what happened in that mall. I was defined by what I did afterward, by the choices I made, by the woman I became despite the cruelty I experienced. The frightened 5-year-old girl was still part of me. I could feel her fear, her resilience. But so was the strong 36-year-old woman who had built a life with purpose. Both versions could exist together. The abandoned child and the survivor, the wounded and the healed. As I reached my car, I whispered quietly, words meant for the little girl who once stood in that toy aisle counting to 60. "We made it," I whispered to the memory of that 5-year-old girl. "We're okay now." 1 week later, something happened at the Arthur Bennett Foundation that stunned everyone. Our first resource center officially opened. We had renovated an old community building downtown and turned it into something new, something safe. The center included tutoring rooms, counseling offices, a small legal clinic, and a large, comfortable common area where children could simply exist without pressure, judgment, or fear. More than 200 people attended the opening. Foster parents came to learn what support we could offer. Social workers arrived hoping for another lifeline in an overwhelmed system. Adults who had once been in foster care came to show solidarity. Community members who had followed my story came to witness something hopeful. Local news stations set up cameras, continuing the narrative that had captured the region months earlier. I stood at the podium and looked out at the crowd. Emily sat in the front row, giving me a reassuring smile. Marcus stood beside other board members. Some faces were familiar, many were not. I realized I had been writing this speech in my mind for most of my life. I was abandoned at 5 years old, I began. My voice stayed steady, even though emotions swirled beneath the surface. I grew up believing I was disposable, that something about me made me unworthy of love. But one man saw me differently. Arthur Bennett taught me that family isn't defined by biology. It's defined by choice, by commitment, by showing up every single day. I paused briefly. This foundation exists because every child deserves what Arthur gave me. Someone who chooses them. Someone who believes in them. Someone who never gives up. We exist for the children still waiting for their person. For the kids who lie awake wondering if anyone will ever look at them and decide they're worth the effort. We exist to tell them something simple. You are worth it. You always were. The applause was long and warm. But just as it began to fade, something unexpected happened. James Whitmore stood up. He slowly approached the microphone. I stepped aside in surprise as he cleared his throat. "I'd like to say something," he said nervously, glancing at me for permission. I nodded. "My name is James Whitmore. I'm the security guard who found Catherine in that mall in 1993. A ripple of recognition moved through the audience. "I did my job that day," he continued. "I called the police. I filed the report. I stayed with her until someone could take care of her. But for 30 years, his voice faltered slightly, I carried guilt. I wondered if I could have done more. If there was something I missed that might have changed things." He took a slow breath. "When I saw Catherine on the news, when I saw that she had become a judge, and when I testified at that trial and saw the woman she had become, I cried. But then I realized something. The best way to honor that little girl isn't to dwell on what I didn't do. It's to help with what she's doing now." He reached into his jacket pocket and pulled out an envelope. "This is a check for $50,000, he said, "my entire retirement savings." Gasps moved through the room. "It's for the children who need someone to see them the way I saw Catherine. Maybe I can't change the past. But maybe this can change someone's future." The room erupted in applause. Some people even stood. Tears streamed down my face as I hugged him. "You already saved me once," I whispered. "You don't owe me anything." James hugged me back and quietly replied, "I'm not doing this for you. I'm doing this with you." After the ceremony, people stayed for tours and refreshments. The building buzzed with energy, questions about programs, offers to volunteer, ideas for partnerships, exactly the kind of hopeful momentum I had dreamed about. Later that afternoon, as we were cleaning up, Emily's phone rang. She answered. Her expression changed immediately. She found me across the room. "We have a little girl," she said softly, 6 years old. "Police found her wandering alone in Jefferson Park about an hour ago. They think she was abandoned. She's scared. She won't talk." She didn't need to finish the sentence. I grabbed my keys. "I'm going." 20 minutes later, I arrived at the center. The little girl sat on a couch in the common room. She clutched a worn backpack tightly to her chest. Her eyes were wide with the same fear I remembered feeling decades earlier. A police officer stood nearby and looked relieved when I entered. I knelt down so I was at her eye level. Just like Arthur had done for me, I asked the same question he once asked. "Are you cold? Would you like some hot chocolate?" The girl nodded slightly. I wrapped a soft blanket around her shoulders and sat beside her. Not too close, just close enough to let her know she wasn't alone. A moment later, Emily arrived carrying a mug of hot chocolate. Together, we simply sat with her. No pressure, no interrogation, just presence, just safety. Emily spoke gently to the child. "You're safe now," she said. "We'll figure everything out together." Watching Emily comfort that frightened girl, something settled deep inside me. The cycle had been broken. The abandoned child had become the protector. Arthur's legacy was still alive. Through me, through Emily, through every child, the foundation would help. History wasn't repeating itself. It was being redeemed. One child at a time. I was abandoned at 5 years old. But today, I choose who I become. And I choose to be the person I needed back then. If this story moved you, if you felt the pain of that 5-year-old girl abandoned in a mall and the strength of the woman who turned that pain into purpose, consider subscribing to the channel. Share this story with someone who needs to hear that survival is possible, that chosen family can be stronger than biology, and that our worst moments don't have to define us. What part of Catherine's journey resonated most with you? Was it Arthur's unconditional love, Emily's courage to choose truth over comfort, or Catherine's decision to turn pain into protection for others? Tell your story matters too, and this community is here to listen. Remember, you are not defined by what was done to you. You are defined by what you choose to do next. Thank you for being here.